Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, it's finally time for Tangerine Dream, odds and ends. Alright then, I may have finished all the individual reviews for Tangerine Dream albums I plan to do, but with a band like this, even delving into the depth I already had before is just barely scratching the surface of their full output. Not only did Tangerine Dream just regularly keep at it, putting out dozens upon dozens upon dozens of albums after my 1986 cutoff point, to the point where they've released over 100 studio projects in total, but that's also not even getting into their live albums, to which many fans consider extremely important to mention, since most of the material on their live albums is completely original and doesn't overlap with the material on their studio albums. That also doesn't get into their soundtrack work either, since they've scored loads of films and other things over so many decades that they've got at least 30 soundtrack albums to their name, and that doesn't get into all the loads of compilation releases that feature original tracks their own, and that's not even to get into the fact that Edgar Froese put out a handful of solo albums under his own name. Now, if I talked about every single one of these projects, I'd probably end up with like a Quentin review-sized video that would be no fun to make and nobody would want to watch in full. And not to mention, if we're being brutally honest, from what I can tell, the majority of projects that TD released past my cutoff point just won't be all that interesting to talk about to begin with. As I kinda alluded to when I first put up my review of Electronic Meditation, this band's career arc very much mirrors that of The Simpsons, a period of game-changing greatness overwhelmed by decades of mediocrity. So this video obviously will not be 100% comprehensive in talking about everything related to this band and their output. I'm only talking about a handful of projects in each of those categories I've mentioned, just the ones I felt like would deliver something interesting of note to talk about and paint a clear enough picture of their full history. A small fraction of their overall output, which my analysis of will still almost certainly be stretching over like 2 entire hours or something like that anyway. So let's just get into it. To start with, we need to talk about studio albums that came out after Underwater Sunlight, mostly to give a rough outline of the rest of their decades of history, though I will be going into a bit more detail on the era immediately following that album to demonstrate why I put the cutoff point for this series in the exact place that I did. The next album to come out after the ones I already covered was Tyger in 1987, their last studio album with Jive Electro within the Blue Years era, their last album to chart at all, reaching number 88 on the UK Albums chart, and most notably, their final album to feature contributions from Christopher Franke before he finally called it quits on the band. I did see a couple of people confused as to why I stopped the series at Underwater Sunlight instead of stopping at this one, which historically speaking feels like it would make for a more natural point to stop, and the answer to why is very simple. I wanted to leave the series on a positive note. Make the last video in the series focused on an album I knew I actually liked or at least had good memories with. I did technically have memories of attempting to try out this album in high school, however, I distinctly remember not being able to even make it past the first track out of immediate distaste for a bit of a new development in the TD sound. An actual singer with actual lyrics. And not like Steve Joliffe doing some shaky prog rock singing on Cyclone, I mean like a contemporary pop singer. Well, technically a jazz singer, Jocelyn B. Smith, but her voice very much strikes me as similar to that of the top-selling pop singers of the time, such as Whitney Houston. 5 seconds of hearing that were enough to make me immediately nope out on the album. Granted, it does appear that this album is generally well received by fans, so there was a part of me who wondered whether or not that knee-jerk reaction I had was actually warranted, especially since Underwater Sunlight still held up to me as well as it did. So I sat down, gave this album a couple of good, open-minded listens, and no, I still do not like this one. I think it's worse than Lay Park. For the record, this is not Jocelyn B. Smith's fault. She is clearly a very talented singer and is putting plenty of passion into her vocal performances here, both sung and spoken. I question the decision to include her in the first place, but I can't fault what she actually brought to the table. Nor can I lay fault at the lyrics, which are all pulled directly out of centuries-old poems by William Blake. What does suck about this album is the creative direction they decided to go with here, going even further down the commercial pop route that Lay Park started and amplifying all my biggest problems with that album. Underwater Sunlight could get away with the obvious datedness of its production thanks to retaining their unique style through the compositions and songwriting. It's an album that still sounded like Tangerine Dream. But Tyger demonstrates just how fine a line that album was really walking on, because even in all the moments without any singing, this project not only feels so sonically over-sanitized and bland, with a sound palette that could have been heard in any number of other top-selling albums or singles from 1987, but it's also so suffocatingly overproduced and lacking in any subtlety. And the addition of the vocals only does more to cement that feeling that they were just further watering their sound down in an attempt to appeal to a wider audience. The title track may immediately leave the worst taste out of any track here, feeling like any number of chart-topping pop R&B hits of the time, with all the hyper-sentimentality and saccharine, faux-inspirational slant of that era's charity singles, right down to Smith's self-harmonizing imitating the effect of a gospel choir, and somehow still managing to get buried by the synths in a few places. But even when you get past that to the other parts which should work better for Tangerine Dream in theory, it still mostly leaves me cold. I guess the best part was the expansive 12-minute instrumental Alchemy of the Heart. That tries to bring in a bunch of classical flares with some melodies that sound like they're being played on harpsichords, a decently pretty piano solo at the end, and a scattered retooling of other ideas from old tracks like Song of the Whale with less memorable melodies and more generically Phil Collins-y percussion. The other tracks with vocals in the 14-minute London and the 6-minute Smile show Smith toning down her performance over comparatively more ambient-leaning meanders, even if some of her more dramatic narrations on the former were pretty ridiculous, and I did not like that whole section at the end of that track with Froese's cheesy guitar soloing and all the grating synth horns. And the pair of more propulsive electro-pop kind of bonus tracks at the end, 21st Century Common Man, Parts 1 and 2, I feel like they're trying to recapture some of those most propulsive moments of their early 80s catalog, such as Midnight and Tula, but they come off so blaring and obnoxious and sound like a total clusterfuck. And man, those Sega Genesis-ass bass lines don't feel like a good fit for them. They come off like a failed attempt to try something more funky. Throughout this album, there's no sense of dynamics or space. The melodies leave no impact. When it's not over the top to the point of oversold cheesiness, it's a flavorless slog. Christ, at least the title track had a hook. That's something to go for it. It's possible your experience may vary depending on what version of the album you get. There's a 1992 CD re-release, which I also heard thanks to it not sounding quite as overbearingly produced, but that version also saw the title track and Smile pitched up slightly for no good reason, like the master tapes were accidentally being played at the wrong speed. And it had a bonus track called Vigor, which I really didn't care for either, for the same reasons I wasn't crazy about 21st Century Common Man. At the end of the day, it is still worth noting that, much like White Eagle, I very much appear to be in the minority with my take on this one, and most people I've seen really like it. Perhaps if one has more of a stomach for 80s cheese than I do, it'll be easier to recommend. But, I don't know, man, I just don't find this album fun to listen to. I found all the late 80s cliches more annoying than anything, and even its best moments just left me wanting to go back to Underwater Sunlight again. This was the moment where TD had officially lost all the elements to their sound that made me a fan of theirs, and if I'm being generous, I'm feeling like a 4.5 out of 10 on this. It's not good. But hey, while we're on this topic, since they were still getting press attention and other people still cared about what they were doing at this point, how about we talk about the rest of this era that took them through the end of the 80s? Beginning a short era known as the Melrose years, their next album is Optical Race from 1988. This one also seems to be generally well remembered by fans. Chris Franck has technically kinda sorta been replaced with a new member, Ralph Vadeful, but not really. He would only contribute to one track on this album and already leave the band by the next album, though he and Froese would record a Tangerine Dream album together called Blue Dawn in 2006, where the two had roughly equal input. I did not listen to that one. I digress, it's pretty much just the duo of Froese and Hasslinger at this point. Though this album is also notable for being their first release on the label Private Music, which was founded and run by former Peak Period TD member Peter Baumann. That's neat. Anyway, this album's okay. I don't hate it. It does mark a pretty noticeable change in production style. They're first to be primarily made using a computer, so by default everything feels a lot stiffer and more obviously MIDI programmed. Strangely enough, I kinda welcome the change. There is the slightest novelty in getting to hear all these familiar keyboard tones that have been so regularly in use since Exit being reshaped from the ground up on a computer. And that cleaner and simpler sound was somewhat refreshing coming off the heels of Tyger, which tried to lay down its sound so thick and got to be too much. Mind you, it's not so much of a breath of fresh air where I'd actively recommend this album to people or want to come back to it. The sound may be better than projects like Tyger or Lay Park, but first of all, that's not saying much, and second of all, the actual substance behind it isn't anything to write home about. The arrangements are still astoundingly plain and run together a lot. There are a few of the obnoxious 80s cliches still poking through on tracks like Cat Scan, or especially the title track on this thing that got on my nerves. But, I mean, I guess it had its moments. The evolving phases on the 8-minute opener Marrakesh, the more atmospheric New Age-leaning sounds of tracks like Atlas Eyes, Mothers of Rain, and Twin Soul Tribe were cool, and the former of those had a nice, playful and jumpy 5/4 groove. Nice to have some stuff that recaptured some of the things I actually liked about Underwater Sunlight. And the one track that Ralph Waddefel contributed to, Sungates, that was a decent highlight as well. That brought in some nice, mildly classical piano parts. That's about all I can break down, though. It's just the same instrumental synth-pop formula as you've been hearing them regularly hammering at since Lay Park, and it basically just feels like a marginally more respectable repeat of that project. The melodies aren't bad, they're mildly pleasurable in the moment, but they're still nowhere near being as memorable or well-constructed as those which appeared in the era when Johannes Schmolling was still on board. And that includes Lay Park. This album lacks that album's most embarrassing and overtly lazy-sounding moments, but I am more likely to recall the hooks on that one. If you're really curious, it definitely will not ruin your life or anything. It's not terrible. But there's nothing you really need to go out of your way for either. It's better than Lay Park, but it's worse than White Eagle. It's just kind of an album that exists, and I'm feeling like a 5.7 out of 10 on it. The second album in the Melrose Years trilogy was Lily on the Beach in 1989, and Jesus Christ, here's me thinking Optical Race was uninteresting. Production-wise, this sounds pretty much exactly the same as that album, though they are maybe trying to add a bit more texture in the sense that there's more focus on guitars. Both in terms of Edgar soloing and the harpsichord-like synths which sound more and more like 80s guitars. Also, the percussion starts to include more and more of those standard stock MIDI sounds, especially in the cymbals, and the bass just sounds like the stock MIDI patch for fretless bass as well. It's like an attempt to sound more organic, but by the cheapest means possible. And compositionally, well, I hope you really loved the melodies on the filler moments of Optical Race, because this is an album entirely made out of filler like that. There's one semi-decent tune acting as the opener, although it's unfortunately called Too Hot for My Chinchilla, and I don't know why you would title a song that. There's a single track focusing on MIDI piano called 29 Palms, which is enough of a breath of fresh air to give a pass. There's a track called Crystal Curfew, which is enough of a jump in energy to turn my head for about the first 20 seconds. And the last track, Long Island Sunset, is notable for having saxophone and flute performances, care of Hubert Waldner, introduced as well, being stretched out to a more monotonous 7 minutes compared to most other tracks sitting around a relatively breezy 3-4 minutes. But that's everything that sticks out to me on the entire album. Man, Tyger may have been more of an active headache for me to sit through, but I think this may have been worse, just for being more thoughtless and vapid. At least Tyger felt like there was a direction to it and ideas to express. This is just a bland and generic 80s pop summer vibe, set for an hour with no meaningful variation, pure background music with no meaningful substance. It's pleasant to have on and doesn't deliver anything that outright annoys me, save for maybe the first 10 seconds of Gecko. An hour of nondescript but competently produced Miami Vice vibes with some standard MIDI instrumentation is still the kind of thing that can easily find its audience. I've seen some people go to bat for this album for the combinations of electronic and 80s rock aesthetics, and in particular being among the more overtly rock-leaning projects in their repertoire. For me, the rock elements are not my thing, only serving to water their sound down even further than it already was and leaning into the late 80s equivalent of monogenre slop. Force Majeure was an album that actually rocked. This is just lifeless and dull. Maybe some people will mess with it, but as far as I'm concerned, there's a good reason nobody really talks about Lily on the Beach, and it's because it doesn't really offer anything to talk about. Feeling a solid 4 out of 10 on it. The last in the Melrose Years trilogy is, of course, Melrose in 1990. Notable not just for being the first TD album in the 90s, but also the final album with Paul Hasslinger on as a member, and the first album to properly introduce a new member of the band, one who would go on to have the fourth longest tenure in the band at 16 years going on from that point onwards, nearly as long as Chris Franke's tenure with a comparable level of input, and that new full-time member is Jerome Froese, Edgar's son, the baby on the cover of Atom, and I think also the kid peeking through the other end of that neon window thing on the cover of Exit. He also played guitar on one track on Lily on the Beach called Radio City, though I didn't mention it in that segment since I didn't notice that track existed while it was on. I will say this album is at least better than Lily on the Beach, just by merit of having better production. The synths sound a lot smoother than on the last two albums and are easier to get yourself immersed in. Jerome's guitar soloing is surprisingly a little flashier and more hard-hitting than his dad's. Even the percussion isn't quite as stiff aside from the 10-minute Desert Train, which focuses its percussion entirely on the default MIDI sound font that still comes pre-packaged with all computers. Out of the Melrose Years trilogy, it is technically the best sounding, a little less generic 80s and a little more Tangerine Dream. Songwriting and composition-wise, however, there's still absolutely nothing to note. It's once again pure background music filler that all sounds exactly the same. The melodies are able to convey more of a sense of dramatic stakes and emotion than the last one, but just like that album, there's nothing really to differentiate the tracks apart from each other. The title track has another sax solo and the closer is more stripped back and piano-heavy, and that's it. It's another hour of material designed to capture a vibe without delivering anything beyond the surface level to engage with. I guess credit for the vibe itself being better executed, but that's as far as I can go. I still much prefer Optical Race for the fact that I can actually tell that album's tracks apart from each other, and I'm feeling a solid 5 out of 10 on this. Now, as we get further along into TD's history and move into the 90s and beyond, it becomes a lot less important to talk about each album they came out with individually for obvious, already mentioned reasons. But in order to further outline their history, I'll talk about a handful of the more major releases that appear to be more interesting or demarcated an important part in their history. To start off with, we have Rockoon in 1992, the beginning of the era which would become known as the Seattle years, in which they were signed to Miramar, and the first TD studio album to be the sole efforts of Edgar and Jerome as a father-son duo. In fact, Jerome actually handled the majority of the songwriting on this one. He wrote 8 of the 11 tracks on here, while Edgar only wrote 3. Though, surprisingly, Jerome didn't handle lead guitars on most tracks. That was instead handled by guest musician and future full-time TD member Zlatko Perica. It was also their first studio effort to be nominated for a Grammy in the then relatively new category of Best New Age Album, an honor which each of the albums they released in this Seattle Years era would also be nominated for. And, as we all know, the Grammys are definitely an institution that can be trusted as a marker of actual quality and not just being well-connected in the industry or that kind of thing. As for what I actually think of the album, basically copy-paste my thoughts on Melrose onto this. It sounds like Tangerine Dream. The production is nice and pleasant and well-polished, if still clearly 80s. Hits on the general emotional notes you'd want a TD album to hit. And compositionally, it's all background music filler without any hooks or anything else to really note beyond the surface level vibe. Now, it does run together marginally less than Melrose. Jerome's self-advertised claim to fame, as mentioned on his website and personal Bandcamp page, is that he apparently invented his own style that he calls Guitar-tronica. Which, are you fucking serious? Guitar-tronica? Shut the fuck up. But I guess that could be a fitting description for what this album is. Despite mostly focusing on the same atmospheric and melodic synth blends that the band had already been focusing on in the albums leading up to this point, it is clear they cared about keeping those big wailing 80s guitar solos in the mix, with a couple of tracks like Graffiti Street and Funky Atlanta trying to combine the usual TD sound with some stadium-friendly arena rock stylings. By the way, what the fuck was these guys' song title game on this album? Tracks here called Funky Atlanta, Big City Dwarves, Touchwood, Penguin Reference, Body Corporate, or right down to the album title, Rockoon. It's like a cocoon, but it rocks, man. Look, for all the fun I'm poking on this album, it's perfectly fine for what it's going for. There's nothing embarrassing or cringeworthy in terms of the actual listening experience, and it's all very pleasant to have on in the moment. I would be lying if I said the whole relaxing vibe of it all and even the occasional more rocking moments didn't hit for me on at least some level. More so than Melrose did. I do tend to like new age music, and this has the ability to hit in that vein. But if you're actually looking for anything to engage with beyond the generally nice vibes, you'll want to look elsewhere. I'll be generous and let this off with a 5.5 out of 10. The other album in the Seattle era that got them all the Grammy noms, which I felt might be worth mentioning, was Turn of the Tides from 1994. This one is primarily notable for the introduction of another one of the longer-running TD members, saxophonist and keyboardist Linda Spa, who would stick around on and off through many a TD album throughout the 90s, 2000s, and even early 2010s. Well, technically it's not her first appearance on a TD record. She did prominently appear on the also Grammy-nominated 1983 live album 220 Volt Live. And given the handful of sax solos appearing on Rockoon, I suspect those might have been handled by her as well, albeit uncredited, but I don't have any source to confirm that besides my own gut feelings. But this is the first album in which she is a full-time member of the band, contributing on a more direct musical level instead of just acting as a guest musician. Also, the guest guitarist from Rockoon, Zlatko Perica, was added on as a full-time member as well, though only for this album. He would already be gone by the next album, Tyranny of Beauty, which I only feel like name-dropping because that album apparently had a companion interactive CD-ROM release exclusive to the goddamn Philips CDI, which is hilarious. What a crossover. But I didn't actually care enough to listen to that album. I assume it sounds kind of like Turn of the Tides. I did listen to Turn of the Tides, though, so here's my quick thoughts on that. Surprisingly enough, I think it's pretty decent. It's definitely their most overtly new age release up to this point, very much following in Rockoon's footsteps. The production, especially when it comes to the stock MIDI percussion, may still be a bit on the cheap side, and the arrangements are once again just going for that whole pure moods aesthetic. Music to relax to and have in the background not to engage with. This particular style may have the reputation of being something of a punchline, maligned for years for being low-effort and substanceless relaxation music that happened to consistently sell really well and make for an easy way to make a quick buck, especially throughout the late 80s and 90s. And boy, would it be easy to write off TD's material throughout the 90s as that exact kind of thing. But at the same time, I tend to like new age music. I do have genuine nostalgia for this particular sound and aesthetic from a bunch of projects I grew up with, like Kevin Wood's Scenic Listening, or this energizing CD from Tylex Fresh Shower. Literally grew up with these and still love them. I do think there is plenty of quality and substance to be found in music that was released under this marketing umbrella. Stuff that sounds like this tends to be more of my bag than the regular old 80s pop sounds they were focusing on before, so long as you have the production to back yourself up. Mind you, Turn of the Tides is no Andreas Vollenweider level gem. It still very much runs together and lacks in actual hooks. Once again, very much an album more designed to be about the overall relaxing vibes than actually delivering anything of substance to latch onto. The most memorable cut here is just a cover of Modest Miskorgi's Pictures at an Exhibition, played entirely on horns over field recordings of Rain or something. But, I don't know, ignoring the weak-ass MIDI drumming, I do feel like the rest of the tracks here were able to deliver at least some substance in the form of the greater variety in instrumental textures. From the various different ways the guitars are incorporated, both acoustic and electric, the saxophones and horns, on top of the various keyboards, both in terms of ambient pads, pianos, synth imitation marimbas, and that kind of shit. All of it sounds really nice. There was one track, Jungle Journey, where the percussion actually got some punch to it again. Most of the tracks themselves also feel like they evolve and change over time a bit more, and don't feel quite as stagnant. Look, I'm not gonna die on a hill for Turn on the Tides. All the criticisms I've leveled at the previous several albums still apply. It doesn't really have the unique sound Tangerine Dream is known for, aside from some moments on Hyperborea that might have some passing resemblance. And it's exactly the kind of release that people think of, well, they're making fun of new age music. If you hate that genre, this will do absolutely nothing to change your mind on it. I myself wouldn't say there's anything so exceptional here actually worth keeping around, but I like the way it sounds. I like the added instrumental texture and think the new age vibes are generally well executed and immersive enough for what they are for me to say I generally enjoyed myself. It's nothing special. I'm never going to listen to this again, but it's decent. I'm willing to let it off with a 6.5 out of 10. Moving past there, the 90s also saw TD eventually breaking off Miramar and going independent, starting up their own label called TDI to self-release projects on, starting a new era called the TDI Millennium Years. And boy, if you thought this band was prolific before, when they don't have a label head telling them what to do, could they release even more frequently? Especially once we get into the 2000s, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself there. I'm mostly going to gloss over this era. It has albums such as Goblin's Club and Ambient Monkeys, which I haven't listened to. Yes, that is a real album title and cover. But there's one last project from the very end of the 90s I want to talk about, which they released on TDI. It's called Mars Polaris, and it came out in 1999. So, in my Underwater Sunlight review, I vaguely hinted that back in my high school days, even if my attempts to chart further into the TD catalog mostly didn't go anywhere, there was one last album released after it which I did actively listen to a couple of times, and I generally had positive leaning memories with. And yeah, it's this one. As a high schooler, I just saw the title and album cover of this one, as well as all the song titles being full of space imagery like Comet's Figurehead, Rim of Schiaparelli, Spiral Stardate Level P, except the P is like the astronomical symbol for Pluto, Mars Mission Counter, Pilots of the Ether Belt, and whatnot. That looked too intriguingly cool for me to want to pass up. There's nothing like a good space-themed record. And, dare I be so bold to imply, but this album is good. The first record I'm covering so far in this video that I actually consider to be properly good, as well as the first one successfully able to recapture what I actually enjoyed in TD's music in the first place. Not great or outstanding, mind you, nothing that reaches the heights of their classics, just pretty good. But considering the bar they've been more consistently hitting, fuck, I'll take what I can get. It's another effort helmed by Edgar and Jerome alone without any other guests, though they didn't work on any of the material here together. They each composed half the track listing separately. Jerome made 4 tracks on his own and Edgar made 6, although Jerome's tracks are significantly longer than Edgar's and take up slightly more of the album. His tracks average around 10 minutes each, compared to Edgar's, which each sat around 4, 5, 6 minutes. But you wouldn't be able to tell they recorded it all separately from the way the material actually turned out. The sound of this album is exactly as uniform as most of the other albums I've been talking about in this video so far. Which, yes, does mean it once again kinda all runs together and there's not much in the way to differentiate tracks apart from each other, though, first of all, that's less bothersome when the sound is as well executed as it is, full of all the same atmospheric synths and smooth but foot-tapping grooves that I liked on the most toned-down moments of Hyperborea, for instance. With a couple of the new age-isms and some instrumentation choices mostly on the percussion end. Not as obviously MIDI heavy, but still trying to have that whole semi-organic relaxation tape edge to it. Though with everything else focusing so much more heavily on the actual synths and creating those spacier vibes to match the imagery the packaging and song titling promises, it's doing a lot better to actually recapture the kind of sound and style that made me a fan of TD in the first place than any album of theirs has since, well, Underwater Sunlight. Though on top of that, it even runs together slightly less than most of the albums I've talked about so far in this video. There are a couple of tracks that have their own identity, like the more drum and bass breakbeats showing up on Astrophobia, the brighter rock-leaning flares on Deep Space Cruiser, or the marimbas around the corners of closer Dies Martes Transmercury. And even if I don't really have like a specific description for every track, there's just enough of a variety in terms of like the energy level for the tracks to feel more like their own things and for me to not just feel like I'm listening to the same thing over and over. At the end of the day, I can't imagine this is gonna be anything precisely earth-shattering for anyone. There's loads of space-themed ambient music out there that sounds kinda like this, delivered by lots of artists over many decades, all the way up through present day. Like 2 years ago, I reviewed an album by this artist called Lars Leonhard, which sounded almost exactly like this. But for an album this enjoyable and fulfilling to come out of TD in 1999, so far after their initial prime, is definitely a rare occurrence worth revisiting. I think Underwater Sunlight is a better record by merit of having better melodies and no track here being able to hit on the level of Song of the Whale, but this is more or less in the same bracket of enjoyment as that album. I might even come back to this over something like Green Desert. It's good. I'm feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on it. Going from there, I'm going to scroll past most of the TDI years. There were loads of albums released in that time, from like 30 old tapes of live concerts to a series of remix albums called the Dream Mixes to re-recordings of the entire Melrose Years trilogy, among other things. TD was really starting to turn into like a content mill at this point, and there wasn't actually that much in the way of new original material beyond the beginning of a trilogy of albums themed after Dante's Inferno, among a few other projects, none of which I've actually listened to. Although one of them features this singer called Bianca Aqua, who Edgar would go on to marry. By the way, virtually nothing released in the eras with Jerome on board is actually on streaming services at the moment. Let's just say you'll need to do some searching around the internet to get to that stuff. But I'll skip to what I think is the last album within the TDI years era, their 2005 album, Jeanne d'Arc. No one ever really talks about this album that I can see, but it does make for an important demarcation point in their history. Not only was it the final album of theirs that Jerome Froese featured on before he would break off the band to focus on his own solo material, but it was also the first album to feature Thorsten Quationing on as a full-time member. 4 of the 9 tracks here are written by him alone, while 2 are written by Edgar and 3 written by Jerome. And this is notable, as Quationing went on to have the second longest tenure in TD behind only Edgar himself, and he remains in the band up through present day. In fact, Edgar chose him to act as the new band leader for TD after his passing, but we'll get to that much later. This album also marks the return of Linda Spa, who I forgot to mention had broken off the band for most of the TDI era, but came back here and stayed on board for the next several years. Also, Iris Kama was a percussionist on the side here. She joined the band in the early 2000s and stuck around for a while herself. Anyway, there's an album to talk about here, isn't there? Ostensibly a concept album themed around Joan of Arc, which doesn't actually have to do with anything. The music itself is basically just a repeat of Mars Polaris, but with a little more saxophone and choral samples and directly segueing tracks into each other. Much like that album, the production is absolutely top-notch, might even go a bit deeper in terms of its sound design and textural detail, gives you a lot of well-layered mixes that give you plenty to sonically engage with and are all especially pretty. With that said, I cannot say this works quite as well as Mars Polaris for the simple reasons of its length and structuring. This thing approaches 80 minutes in total, which is ordinarily the kind of length I try to defend rather than complain about, but unfortunately it doesn't feel as well justified as it could have been. The album is melodically pleasant, but again doesn't really have anything in the way of tunes memorable enough to stick with me, and while there's just barely enough distinction between tracks for this thing to never feel like it's outright running together, there's not enough distinction where I feel like my written descriptions of any given track would be all that different. The album's structured as if the whole thing is meant to sound like it all came out of a single unbroken jam session. Worse still, I feel like this album had reached what sounded like it could be a satisfactory conclusion at the end of track 6, La Sagesse du Destin, and proceeded to continue on for a full half hour after that. My first listen of this thing left me really drained and had me feeling like even worse produced albums of theirs such as Optical Race or Turn of the Tides would be easier for me to return to. I will say this album did grow on me a fair bit when I gave it a second listen. This is a better album than either of those, but it's also clearly not as good as Mars Polaris, which has nearly the exact same sound with markedly better pacing. That stretches on for 70 minutes, but is able to pace it well so the length felt perfectly normal and reasonable to me. This album definitely needed some trimming down, and that seems to be a universally agreed upon point from people I've seen who have actually heard this one. I'll still say this album is decent to good. The sound is well executed enough where it'll probably be worth checking out if you loved Mars Polaris and you're willing to put up with the length. It's probably the best produced album I've talked about in this video so far, but I seriously doubt I'll be returning to it after putting up this video, and at my most generous I can only let it get away with like a 6.7 out of 10. Anyway, moving on from there, shortly after Jerome's departure in 2005, the TDI label rebranded to Eastgate, marking the beginning of a new era for the band called the Eastgate Years. And if you thought the TDI Years era was prolific, it's absolutely nothing compared to the Eastgate Years era. So many dozens upon dozens of Tangerine Dream albums came out in this era through the latter half of the 2000s and early 2010s. Multiple album series, including the 5 Atomic Seasons series of albums like Springtime in Nagasaki or Winter in Hiroshima, which I think were helmed by Edgar alone. Or the run of Sonic Poems albums based on old poetry like Finnegan's Wake or Edgar Allan Poe's The Island of the Fae. I think the latter was where violinist Toshiko Yamane joined the band in 2011, which is mainly notable because she still remains in the band up through present day. And of course, most notably, this was the era that gave us all those mostly pointless re-recordings of their classic albums, such as Tangram 2008, Hyperborea 2008, or Phaedra Papyrus Edition, as I've come to nickname it. And so many more albums between all of that. I haven't listened to nearly any of these projects out of intimidation by the huge quantity on display that somehow dwarfs even that of their previous eras. I assume most of them are decent to good, if nothing outstanding. But in place of sitting through all that stuff, TD did put out a series of compilation albums called Booster, ostensibly designed for anyone looking to catch themselves up on TD's 2000s work, but unwilling to wade through the vast sea of their output. To be honest, this Booster series also got it kinda out of hand, with 7 volumes stretching all the way into 2015, progressively taken up more and more by re-recordings or straight re-releases of classic period or late 80s stuff, and quickly becoming kinda meaningless. So I only listened to the first volume in the series from 2007, which was primarily designed to compile a load of loose promotional singles and EPs they released in that era. It's one of the easiest projects from this era to find. It seems to be pretty popular and well loved by fans. Now, this comp does have its small handful of pointless retreads of classic material, like a new version of Sphinx Lightning called Hyper Sphinx, which might add a little more drums and guitars, but it's hard to tell, and it bizarrely fades out before reaching the actual climax of the track. There's new re-recordings of excerpts from Logos and Tangram that exist. We'll get to Logos later in this video, don't worry. Also, interestingly, there's one re-recording of an old track which actually justifies its existence. The track Lady Monk on this thing is a retooling of Zen Garden from Lay Park that adds in this much thicker, almost industrial-tinged beat and some propulsive bass synth arpeggios that give the track a completely different energy, which I found to be quite interesting. The rest of the material on this comp mostly focuses on all the exact same blends of sounds you've heard on albums like Mars Polaris and Jeanne d'Arc, though perhaps approaching these sounds through somewhat more simplistic and rudimentary compositions. Basically just Edgar setting down a beat and doing some mild melodic vibing over it. Sometimes that ends up with something mostly mid-tempo and exactly as vibe-centric as you would expect. See One Night in Space, I Could Hear It When the Moon Collapsed on Broadway, World Away from Gaga Land. What silly titles, Edgar? There's no nights in space. Sometimes the grooves get more propulsive energy, like on The Greek Mirror or Sleeping Watches Snoring in Silence. There are tracks that build themselves out of simpler ambience and bring in a whole bunch of neat progressions, like the exclusive original track All Thirsty Angels Pass, or the 14-minute closer Bells of Aqua, which brings in some acoustic guitars and later choral parts that kind of give it the feel of some of their 90s era stuff. Both notable highlights. There's also a track called Tangerines On and Running, which has some brighter melodic flares that feel like Edgar's attempt to recapture the Exit era style. It's okay. There's a darker drum and bass flavored track called Ça va, ça marche, ça ira encore, pulled from the late 90s and has a lot more stock MIDI drumming than any other track here. It's fine. And there's a pair of tracks from Thorsten Quationing all by himself, called Metaphor Part 1 and 2, and they're actually among the best tracks here, kind of starting out all subtle and IDM influenced, and progressing into some more energetic territory later. Look, I can't bring myself to say anything on this comp is absolutely essential listening. There's no great tracks here, but it's all cool enough, and from what I can tell is sufficiently representative of what they were doing in this particular era, for one to generally get the gist of what the era sounded like. Also, ironically, despite being 2 hours long, the whole looser compilation structuring of it might have actually made it a slightly easier listen for me than Jeanne d'Arc, so take that as you will. I'm not going to give this a score because compilation, but it's nice. Now, there's one more studio album I wanted to talk about before we move on to other things that people are likely to care a lot more about. In 2010, they put out an album called Undercover, originally called Undercover Chapter 1, but Edgar passed away before Chapter 2 could ever come to be. This doesn't mark any special new development in the band's lineup or history or anything. This album does have a different member who I haven't mentioned yet, Bernard Babel, on it, although this is not the point at which he joined. I wanted to cover this one, though, because the idea behind it so completely caught me off guard that I didn't want to pass it up. See, this is a covers album, but it's not like covers of fellow ambient or synth legends or anything like that. No, this is covers of, like, classic rock and pop songs. Pink Floyd's Wish You Were Here, The Eagles' Hotel California, R.E.M.'s Everybody Hurts, David Bowie's Space Oddity and Heroes, The Beatles' Norwegian Wood, Leonard Cohen's Alleluia and Suzanne, and more. This is a real thing that exists. Apparently it came about when one of TD's promoters jokingly suggested that they make an album where they cover big top 40 hits, and Edgar was like, bet. And they went all the way and actually did it. But these are not instrumental covers. On a different album, which I didn't listen to, that they put out a couple of years prior as a sort of tribute to Syd Barrett, called Madcap's Flaming Duty, Yes, that is a real title. Even if all signs point towards that album not being as embarrassing as it probably sounds on paper and more likely to be generically mid from what I've heard about it, surely that title has to be a shark sandwich style attempt to bait the critics on purpose. But anyway, that album included proper vocals, delivered by Chris Housel, one of Thorsten Quaichening's bandmates from his side project band Picture Palace Music, brought on as a guest. So they decided, hey, let's do that again for these covers, have someone actually sing them. For a Tangerine Dream album in 2010. And maybe Quaichening himself can even sing for a couple of them as well. I saw all that description for this project and thought, oh my god, that sounds absolutely terrible, I have to hear this. And, well, actually for the most part, they're playing these tracks mostly straight, and it's disappointingly nowhere near as much of a train wreck as I was expecting it to be. The album is quite bad, mind you, just not in as much of an interesting way as I'd hoped. Not to say it's a complete wash. There's a couple of moments that actually come off as reasonably respectable, at least as much as one could expect Tangerine Dream to deliver in this era. The covers of Space Oddity and Depeche Mode's Precious are perfectly listenable. And the Wish You Were Here cover is alright, too. While Thorsten Quaichening unfortunately decided to handle the lead vocals there and gave a laughably weak performance that nearly ruined it, it is clear that they put more heart into that cut than any of these other tracks, recreating the original instrumental as faithfully as they could, while still giving it a little of that TD edge. Only fitting for this band's long-running love for Floyd, so even if they don't really stick the landing, I can respect them for giving it their all on that one. Unfortunately, these moments are the exception and not the norm. Most of this album just kinda sucks in a pretty non-specific way. Their versions of Hotel California, the Goo Goo Dolls' Iris, or Alphaville's Forever Young are just really underwhelming and sound like shit. There's a couple of moments which feel like they totally missed the tone of the originals, like the weirdly upbeat but emotionally sterile version of Bowie's Heroes, or the surprisingly chaotically produced version of Chris Isaak's Wicked Game, taking this originally stripped-back ballad and covering it in all these super dated 80s beats. And they similarly botched the Beatles' Norwegian Wood. If you wanted a version of that track that sounded like it was trying to top the charts in 1991 and also adds in fake crowd cheering in the beginning and end, then try that, I guess. However, there are two moments on this album that I think were able to deliver the level of an experience I actually went into this album hoping to get. First of all, there's their cover of Kraftwerk's The Model. You know, Kraftwerk, one of Tangerine Dream's close contemporaries, fellow massively influential German synth legends. Sounds like a no-brainer for TD to be covering, right? Probably won't be a slam dunk, but it is certainly a match that makes way more sense than any of these weird covers of, like, the Eagles or the Goo Goo Dolls or whoever. Anyway, Tangerine Dream's version of The Model sounds like this.
She's a model and she's looking good.
They did a fucking smooth jazz cover of Kraftwerk. What the fuck? What did Kraftwerk ever do to you to deserve this act of violence? Oh my fucking god. Now, as hysterical as that cover was, the laughs were mainly contained in my first reaction and it did get diminishing returns. For something that got those good chuckles out of me a bit more consistently, there's the Leonard Cohen Alleluia cover. So, both of the Leonard Cohen covers on this thing are sung by Thorsten Quaichening, who I think we established earlier is not a very good singer. On the Suzanne cover, he's not unlistenable, but nor does he really sell it that well, it's whatever. But on Alleluia, his accent really starts to come in through a lot more obviously, and the results are really something to behold.
Your face was strong, but you needed proof. You saw her battery in the roof. The beauty and the moonlight overthrew you.
Fucking amazing. I have no notes. So, I guess that's Undercover. I went into this expecting it to be my least favorite album covered in this video. I went into this expecting to question its existence and who would actually want this. I went in hoping to find a solid candidate for a career low point, and those expectations were met. Unfortunately, aside from the covers of The Model and Alleluia, it's not bad in the fun way. It's just regular bad. I went into this expecting a near unlistenable joke of an album, and aside from those two moments, that expectation was not met. It's even entirely possible for someone to come into this and be pleasantly surprised by it. As massive and unreliable as their catalog is, I don't think TD have an album that's truly universally disliked, even this album has its fans who are willing to defend it. I'm just not one of them. By my ears, this is just half-assed and boring more than anything. I mean, at least the band probably had fun making it, but yeah, this sucked, and I'm overall feeling a 3.5 out of 10 on it. Okay, I think as far as studio output goes, I'm going to stop there for the time being. How about we finally focus more on something that people actually care about? I think it's finally time we talk about some live albums. While I have been doing this series and uploading my individual reviews of the TD studio albums, probably the single most requested thing which I haven't already talked about is the live albums. And mind you, there is no question why. The material on these albums was often completely original without overlapping at all with the studio material, and perfectly had the ability to stand on their own as if they were studio albums in their own right. Not necessarily applicable to all their live albums, especially once we get into their later periods into the 90s and beyond. You not only see their live albums going more the traditional route of repurposing old familiar studio material, but also again seeing way more of them. But the live albums that actually came out during their actual peak period within the original time span that I set for this discography review from their inception in the 70s to my personal cutoff point in 1986, that stuff actually is absolutely worth delving into. I never made dedicated videos on these, mostly to simplify my workload and because the studio albums do more to tell the story of their history and technical evolution, while the live albums felt more supplementary to that conversation. But now is as good a time as any to actually talk about them, starting, of course, with their first live album from 1975, Ricochet. I already kind of alluded to my feelings on this album in my review of Rubicon, but that does feel like an eternity ago, both to me making this and probably also to anyone who either watched the rest of the series or who are watching this video without having immediately skipped ahead to this point. Remember when this band was like actually cutting edge and putting out genre-defining classic albums and stuff? Surprisingly easy to forget now with all the tangents they've been going on, pun intended. Ricochet is often considered something of a classic in its own right. Perhaps some may say it's just as important to listen to as something like Rubicon. And that includes me. I enjoy this album on the exact same level as Rubicon. Which is to say I think it's a very good album, if not quite necessarily great, or one of my absolute favorite things they have ever done. I'm admittedly not sure which one I like more. Could probably go back and forth depending on my mood. Though, the longer I've sat with both, I think Ricochet might just get the edge over it. Rubicon's production and mastering was a lot better. In comparison to that album's much more spacious and expansive sound, this album's production is more flat and listless without conveying nearly as much depth. However, the musical arrangements on this thing are more consistently strong and exciting. Where Rubicon kind of fell off in its second half and tried to rehash the same ideas to less successful results, Ricochet's two sides are much closer to each other in quality, spreading roughly the same amount of quality equally over both halves. Rubicon's first side is better than both parts of Ricochet, but Rubicon's second side is not as good as either half of Ricochet. Okay. On top of that, I think Ricochet is one of the rare occasions in this era of TD when the second side might actually be a little stronger. The first side is still very strong, evolving from mildly menacing individual bass stabs into a bit of tapping electronic percussion into some bass arpeggios. Going up next to Frank is live drumming and some repeated electric guitar riffs, all very much conveying that sense of forward momentum. Halfway through, progressing into a new, much more fast-paced set of synth arpeggios with more of Edgar's electric guitar soloing on top, and continuing to build upwards and downwards in energy for the rest of the side. Some of Franke's drumming really gets excitingly chaotic, and there's all these dramatic mellotrons brought in many parts, like the best moments of Atom. Some of the lead arpeggios get a lot brighter and more colorful in other parts, and that really drops my attention over those 17 minutes. Though I think the second side of the album brings in a bit more evolution and dimensionality than the first. It actually starts out very peaceful with a whole solo piano passage aided by some actual flute performances from Peter Baumann, very melancholic and lonely sounding, but then some new arpeggios fade in which have a different, much brighter texture to anything that appeared in the first half, as well as some keyboards imitating trumpet sounds, and the mix proceeds to build back up to the same level of energy we were at before, with the arpeggios getting a lot more multi-layered and bringing in all these wailing melodies and little percussion taps. Almost kind of starts to remind me more of the kind of stuff the band would start to do on later albums like Tangerine. A little after the 13-minute mark, there's this whole little detour with all these modulated, incomprehensible vocal sounds echoing into a metallic void, followed by another very melancholic flute passage and some of the brighter lead arpeggios starting to fade back in, and eventually lead into a new passage that focuses more on the arpeggios by themselves, getting more well-layered again and kind of washing over each other without necessarily building towards any kind of greater climax point. There's some watery keyboard solos for a while, and a bit of percussion finally joins back in for the last 2 minutes, and also fades into more minimal ambient passages driven by mellotron choirs at the very end. The way Ricochet just keeps throwing fresh spins on these ideas at you over the course of those 38 minutes absolutely makes it one of the more engaging records in their catalog. While I personally think other albums of theirs can execute similar ideas in a way that engaged me even more, there's a very easy case to be made for Ricochet to be plenty of people's favorite TD record overall, and I'm willing to let it off with a 7.7 out of 10. The next live album of note was Encore in 1977, based on their tour of the US at the time and marking the final appearance on a TD album from Peter Baumann. I actually didn't hear this one back when I was in high school, so I didn't fully know what to expect out of it. On top of that, I feel like I saw more divisive reviews from fans than I would have expected. Some people love it and view it to sit among their best work, and others view it to be more of an inconsistent dud. And, well, hearing it for myself, I can see why its reputation appears to be as split as it is. Out of the live albums I've heard, this is technically the closest to just being a traditional live set rather than a full album of all new material. Though at the same time, it's also not just a single unbroken show either. It's cut together out of unrelated performances. I think Ricochet was as well, to be fair, but the two performances on that album did come together as if they could be one cohesive piece, and this album doesn't really attempt to do that in the same way. Also, it's twice as long with 4 side-long pieces, which themselves have much more of a tendency to run together and fall in the background than Ricochet's performances did. The first 2 sides were apparently the most representative of the corresponding tour, and it's basically just more stuff that sounds somewhere in between the styles of Ricochet and Stratosphere. First cut Cherokee Lane starts off with a somewhat odd-sounding experimental intro with all these amelodic effects washing into foreboding mellotron pads over the first 3 minutes, but quickly settles into a single groove of arpeggiated synths with various melodic riffs playing over it, also various mellotron and flute solos as well. Very straightforward for the most part. Second cut Monolite starts out with a solo piano passage and builds into all these marching rhythms and synth builds that have a particularly bright and almost poppy feel to them, often even building into these standard 4 chords of pop progressions. The later switches into a darker and more driving section that returns more to the Ricochet kind of style with some trumpet-sounding keyboard solos on top, eventually breaking into an entire section that reprises the lead melodies of Stratosphere verbatim. I think also making some melodic nods to their theme tune for the movie Sorcerer, and finally ending with another piano solo that directly echoes the ending of Invisible Limits. It's fun, but it does admittedly leave me itching to go back to Stratosphere instead. I think this was actually my least favorite of the 4 sides, but I do still like how much progression it has to it. Side 3 is called Coldwater Canyon, and in contrast to the first 2 cuts, which were consistent to pretty much all the tour dates, this one was apparently only performed once during that tour and never repeated elsewhere. Though it pretty much sounds just like the previous 2 sides. Simple arpeggiated beats, dramatic chords, and keyboard solos, also a lot more of Edgar's guitar soloing showing up throughout this one. This appears to get singled out as the least favorite of many fans. I guess some people think the guitar soloing goes on too long, though I thought Edgar's performances hit pretty hard. By my ears, the track's much bigger crime is just sounding too similar to the other pieces here and further weighing down the pacing. Though the most interesting part of this album has to be Side 4, Desert Dream, which ironically had nothing to do with this tour at all. It's apparently cut together out of a number of live performances from around 1974, as well as leftover material that didn't make the cut for earlier studio albums. Tonally, it's completely different from everything else here, a lot darker and more experimental and minimalistic, trudging through lots of odd electronic effects and drones that are all interestingly intriguing in their own right, and mostly leaning away from the melodies aside from one passage around the second half, which focuses on a lot of extremely melancholic and sad electric pianos, synth trumpets, and mellotron pads, and one more rhythmic passage right at the end. I guess that makes this the closest one of their records on Virgin to recapturing some of the sounds they were exploring back in the earlier Sight and Atem days, which was inherently more attention-grabbing than all the more accessible sequencer progressions and solos the rest of the album focused on, which had kinda started to get monotonous. At the end of all this, yeah, I gotta say I was having a lot more mixed thoughts on this package than I was expecting to. The arrangements are all, at worst, decently enjoyable, in the same way as their other stuff from the Peter Baumann era was, but it's clearly not as much of a fun time as their other albums from this era. Which, to be fair, isn't necessarily saying much. It is competing with game-changing classics, but still, the presentation of it all can feel oddly slipshod. The sound quality can be kinda rough and inconsistent as well, and unlike Ricochet, which felt like it was material enough to qualify as a studio album in its own rights, this feels more like a supplementary companion piece to add on to Stratosphere than its own standalone thing. Also got diminishing returns the longer I sat with it. It's still probably worth hearing if you're just looking for more stuff out of TD's most well-acclaimed era. It'll probably do well if you wanted something that sounds kinda like Stratosphere, but with more of their earlier improvisational slant. I'll still take it over more than half of the studio projects I've covered earlier in this video, but it's not an absolute must-listen. It's the kind of thing that mostly left me itching to just go back to their other classics from this era instead. And the longer I sat with it, the more ambivalent my feelings on it ended up leaning, so yeah, I think I'm feeling a strong 6.7 on it, and it's probably my personal least favorite of the live albums I'm covering in this video. Okay, next live album, we skip over to 1981 when they put out Quichotte, later re-released in 1986 and retitled Pergamon. Now this one I know I heard at least once or twice in high school, though I'll freely admit I didn't actually remember much about it, nor do I really see it get talked about all that often. If Encore was meant as a companion piece to add on to Stratosphere, Quichotte is a companion piece to add on to Tangerine. Several musical elements that show up throughout this album were eventually just directly repurposed into that album. The concert from which this material was pulled was recorded a few months before Tangerine dropped, and additionally this concert is notable for taking place in East Berlin while the Iron Curtain was still up, presumably later informing some of the themes that would show up on Exit later. While once again it's not as good as Ricochet by merit of not standing on its own as well, it is definitely better than Encore. And while some of my biases towards this particular era of TD definitely play into that, it's not by as much as you'd think. To be honest, there's not actually a lot going into this one beyond 40 minutes of triumphant synth builds and layers of arpeggios that the albums from this period have you already coming to expect. But as is often the case with the Johannes Schmolling era, the melodies are more than strong enough to carry it. And not just the familiar ones, those are actually the less interesting moments for me. Hearing the first side play some of those familiar melodic passages from the middle of Tangram Set 1 being played on classical tinged piano, and gradually evolving into new passages, including some of the lead arpeggios from Tangram Set 2, and leading in and out of them with new melodies that segue quite effectively, all very nice, if not as good as actually hearing Tangram. But the real reason to check this album out is the second side. There's not exactly much in the way of sonic progression beyond the usual mildly experimental intro, but the melodies rise to so many different epic and triumphant heights and are just so consistently spirit-lifting and exciting. Early on, I'm almost expecting it to hear it all break into the final movement of Sphinx Lightning, but it somehow manages to keep finding new, equally strong hooks and new peaks to rise higher and higher to, not quite paralleled anywhere else in their catalog. I can't really put it into words. It's like watching a rocket take off and leave the Earth's atmosphere. It's just freaking great. The album as a whole might not be one of the most essential or important moments in the greater context of their catalog, or provide much in the way of discussion material, but it is enough of a fun ride for me to be feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Worth a shot for sure. But speaking of the Johannes Schmolling era, in between White Eagle and Hyperborea, they put out one last live album on version called Logos Live, based on a concert at the Dominion Theatre in London, another one which I didn't hear in high school. Unlike Encore or Quichotte though, this one doesn't have any material that overlaps with their main studio albums, going back to the Ricochet approach of going all original. Though the pieces on display here are clearly not improvised in any way, it's a much more carefully crafted and planned collection of instrumental synth-pop sketches. So, you know, mileage may vary depending on which era of TD you most prefer, but as someone who has those notable biases towards the Johannes Schmolling era, for me this was at least equally on par with Ricochet. It's really damn good. The main bulk of the album, taken up by the 45-minute Logos performance, is typically split into two lengthy parts, but I've also seen a separation of the track listing on a fan-run TD reference site that split Logos into 9 parts, which I can't find confirmation whether or not any official releases label it as such, but I've decided to reference anyway since it makes more sense for how the piece is structured. The 25-minute Logos Part 1 has 5 sub-movements. First we got Logos Intro, which takes lots of wiry and menacing but also somewhat playful melodic stabs of varying shapes, layering over each other on top of a TR-808 drum machine beats, which I have to assume is going for a bit of a classic 80s electro flavor, like the kind outfits like Cybotron would be focusing on shortly afterwards. Though if I didn't know any better, I'd almost think they somewhat resemble a modern-day trap beat. 4.5 minutes in, second movement Logos Cyan moves into a much more ambient sound with a few mild pad melodies floating over a dark bass drone. Then about 7 minutes in, we hit the Logos Velvet movement, which is probably the most easily recognizable section of the whole album. Also the section which was not really remade in the Booster compilation. Probably the strongest and most iconic melodic hook on display here, going over some very simple halftime beats, but feels very bright and triumphant, like evoking a sunrise or something. Really stands out in that way, even from many of the similar material they'd put out through the entire era while Schmoling was on board. Next section, Logos Red, starts about halfway through the side and stretches on for a good 8.5 minutes with a lot of different elements going into it, floating through many eerie ambient pads which start to get quite dissonant and organ-like, and fading in some new echoing beats, but then also introducing some samples that sound like DJs scratching and a crowd of people shouting. First time you can actually hear them use those new digital samplers in an obvious way. Some blockier and cloudier ambient pads come in to replace the old ones. Later, other aggressive bass stabs and sampled loops of cowbell are introduced, as well as chopping up those shouting samples to form some new melodies. Some dreamier plucked melodies come in as well, and some rounder and more rhythmic bass stabs. A lot of different interesting textures coming and going throughout this whole stretch, lots of fun to be had. But then this transitions quite cleanly into the Logos Blue movement, which takes up roughly the last 5 minutes of the first side, going for much more straightforwardly structured chord progressions and melodies, carrying over the same beat as the previous part. Feels rather warm and enveloping, but also driving intense at the same time. On the second side, the piece picks up right from where we left off in Logos Part 2's 4 sub-movements, starting with Logos Black, which has more dark ambient drones and all these windy effects alongside other electronic sounds that evoke like a colony of bats flying or a grandfather clock ticking. This much creepier effect is maintained for the first 4.5 minutes of the side until we reach the Logos Green movement, which brings in these fluttery melodic flourishes and then builds into all these other clattering mechanical beats and disjointed melodic planks, building into other scratchy bass stabs and slightly off-kilter arpeggios. The whole section feels like it's trying to evoke clockwork or turning gears or something like that, which is cool. 9.5 minutes in, we reach the Logos Yellow movement, which brings in a much more energetic and up-tempo beat and all sorts of glittering arpeggios and wiry 80s melodies and chords, very much hitting on a similar style of tracks to theirs like Network 23, kind of floats in and out with sections focusing on either the melodies or the beats that build up and pay off nicely and keep up that brighter and more cheerful mood. This carries on until everything fades out for the last 3 minutes or so, which take up the Logos Coda movement, returning to a much simpler progression of blaring, triumphant minor key synth chords that sort of resemble the Logos Velvet part, but without any melodies in common, and finishes the entire Logos piece on a suitably climactic and satisfying note. Though that's actually not quite everything on the album. The concert's encore is also included in the form of a single new 5-minute piece called Dominion. Another little synth-pop kind of track in the same vein as the stuff on Exit, but much brighter and happier and major key. Just a nice little foot-tapping beat and more triumphant melodies, which are just as catchy as the best parts of the main Logos piece. It feels like it could act as like the victory theme when you reach the staff credits at the end of a video game, or like beat every Grand Prix in a Mario Kart or something like that, and it's great. Now, I don't really have much of anything to complain about with Logos Live. It's really damn good. I think Ricochet might just barely get the edge over it, but they're right on par with each other and get to that level for me for completely different reasons. Ricochet is just a lot more consistently propulsive and exciting and well-flowing, where Logos is a lot more disjointed in its structure, but it's also maybe the most interesting of their live albums that I've heard and gives me the most of substance to dig into. Definitely make sure you don't miss out on this one either. I'm feeling a very strong 7.7 out of 10 on it. The last live album I want to talk about in this video is Poland the Warsaw Concert, released in 1984, and their first release with Jive Electro officially kicking off the Blue Years era. It's another pretty common cutoff point for fans of the band, especially considering the album that immediately follows it is Lay Park. But this album is much more universally well-liked as far as I can see. It was right before their catalog would start to get a lot more hit and miss. I know I heard this album at least once when I was in high school, and I vaguely remember thinking it was cool, if not having any strong feelings on it. Listening to it now, however, I think it's solid. And don't have the strongest of feelings on it. It's a good album, for sure, more near entirely original material exclusive to this album. All very bright, pleasant, and uplifting stuff with plenty of substance. However, I will say that it does have the tendency to fall into the background, and at over 80 minutes total split over 4 sides of vinyl, it does get to be a bit long-winded. Not quite as samey or monotonous as Encore. All 4 pieces do have plenty of evolution and never feel like they're growing stagnant, but the album as a whole does meander, and I wouldn't say any moment on this album matches how instantly striking an album like Logos could be. There's an easy argument to be made that Encore could work better for people on the merits of that being more energetic and exciting for them. Depends on your taste as always. Certainly the tone for what to expect out of the album is set well by the title track. The concert kicks off with TR-808s and aggressive bass stabs and introduce a few darker melodies that not even 3 minutes in get a lot more lighthearted and pleasant. 5 minutes in, there's all the sound of incomprehensible radio chatter. Soon after, there's these kind of rounder, more thumping bass lines coming in, and the percussion starts to get a lot more skittering with what sounds like machines rapidly tapping on wood, and even more melodic layers come in. The composition gets thicker and more propulsive as the beats take on more of a fast-paced marching quality, and Edgar does some guitar soloing over all of it. And all this build-up culminates halfway through the piece when everything just falls away into purely ambient synth choir pads. There's more ambient melodic meandering until a single note plunking bass line is introduced a little before the 14-minute mark, and the piece strips itself back a lot more, only joining that bass line with some very simple muted chords and more contemplative higher-pitched melodies. The track starts to build up more energy before the 16-minute mark hits as more proper beat comes back in, as well as some more bass arpeggios and synth flute melodies. Some warmer filtered chords coming in before the 18-minute mark, and shortly after a much more fluttery high-pitched arpeggio joins in. Around the 20-minute mark, everything but the bass arps and beats have fallen away, and for the last segment in those last 2 minutes, some floaty synth flute melodies and some synth stabs of the same texture as those on their track Exit take the lead, and the piece finally comes to a climactic finish as everything falls away to one last chord. I mean, something new in this track is happening around every corner. No single minute of the 22 minutes that go into that track sounds like another. But I will say the feeling created by all of it kind of remains the same throughout. Exciting in theory, but all these parts flow so seamlessly into each other and change up so often, there's not really any one moment of it that leaves a big impact. Once again, just becoming pleasant background music more often than not. A lot of my feelings on the other tracks on this album are kind of similar, but following track Tangent is probably my favorite of the pieces on display here. At least it's the one which fragments itself in the most obvious way and might have the most memorable ideas going into it, I think. There's a 4-minute segment with some triumphant melodies and marching beats building up and paying off in a cool way. There's some creepy ambience fading into a new section that sounds like a completely different track, a much slower one that bases itself around these squelchy bass stabs which sound like a precursor to 90s acid sounds or something, and has plenty of other eerie effects and wailing pads going over it. 10 minutes in, there's a new purely ambient section, and we fade into the third and most striking section of all, which basically sees them deconstructing Choranzan from the ground up. Same beat, same synth textures, even the same chord progression, but all the melodies on top are totally different, and it's in a different key, and there's a whole digression into all these electronic bad sound effects as well. Interesting twist on the track we all know well that probably got my attention more effectively than, say, Mojave Plan on White Eagle did with a similar idea. Oh yeah, and there's also an encore right after that, occasionally separated into its own track called Rare Bird, which kind of sounds like it's trying to evoke some kind of exotic Asian flavor out of their typical synth textures, complete with gongs in a few spots. Hits me in a very similar way as their track Cinnamon Road on Hyperborea, but without as good a hook. Side 3 is called Barbicane. This cut starts out extremely peaceful and minimalistic, perhaps bringing in a few of the light percussive stabs from No Man's Land to tap over the melancholic melodic meandering, and kind of evolving through a whole segment taking up nearly half the track that seems to be rebuilding the general idea of that track from scratch without reusing any other sounds from it and ending in a synth oboe solo. The segment does fade out completely into subtle ambience noise without any applause, which is a little unnatural. Probably the result of the way this band often partially recreates their live concerts in the studio to release them for these albums. The second segment has a lot of proto-trance-like arpeggios and rhythms, but an extremely heavy 80s beat going up against it, and a few big fanfare-like melodies that start to have a little bit of the Jean-Michel Jarre flavor we'd start to see on Lake Park. Apparently this segment was released as a standalone single called Warsaw in the Sun. Slightly ironic because the concert took place at night in the freezing cold. And the third segment of this cut, which transitions out of the last section a lot more naturally and kind of mirrors some of the more exotic flavors of the way the track started, with lots of different layers of melodic plinking in all different shapes and sizes. And then that finally takes us to side 4, called Horizon. Also starts out very low-key, but in darker territory than the previous side did, mostly foreboding drones and effects for a few minutes with some extremely slow pan flute melodies later, and all number of other melodic textures gradually getting much more well-defined over the next several minutes, and progressing into this very warm, tender, and well-enveloping section that takes up the second quarter of the track. There's a transition into a section of more filtered ambient chord paths that continue to evoke that warm and enveloping effect, but in a much more melancholic manner. And then about 14 minutes in, we fade into a much more energetic final section with all these nervous bass lines and marching percussion and dramatic chords coming back in, building up to a height of intensity we haven't felt out of the album in like the past 40 minutes, and reaching its final note at the end. And that is finally everything on Poland, which is a lot. In one breath, I would be lying if I said this was one of my biggest personal favorites in their catalog. If you listened to Hyperborea and Lay Park back-to-back and wondered how in the hell did we get from point A to point B, Poland absolutely acts as the logical midpoint between those albums, very much retaining the wider scale and sound palette of Hyperborea, but with arrangements that aren't nearly as memorable or striking on average, and many moments of which start to predict that much poppier and more lighthearted approach they'd show on Lay Park. Also, the album can absolutely get a bit exhausting at over 80 minutes long, while better justifying that time than the Jeanne d'Arc album I covered earlier in this video. I do always feel the length on this one anytime I put it on. But at the same time, I do have to respect everything they did there. I've seen people talk about White Eagle as exploring a more tender and emotional side to the band's sound previously unexplored in the same way, and while I don't personally see it on that particular album, outside of its closer, the rest is a bit too skeletal to hit for me in that way, this album feels like I'm actually hearing what those people were talking about. A lot of this album is taken up by lower key and tender ambience, which is well designed to tug at some of those heartstrings and pulling it off even better than many of their other albums from this era, especially looking at tracks like Horizon. Much of this album may bounce off me without anything really sticking in my memory, and I'd still rather listen to Hyperborea exploring similar territory in a much tighter package. I think Pergamon got a little more excitement out of me too, but this is an important moment in their catalog that I can see exactly why so many treasure it in the way they do. And I think I got enough out of it to just let it off with a 7.3 out of 10. Okay. And that's going to be it for the live albums. I know there's plenty of others. There was also their fake concert, Livemiles, which was technically the real STD project to still have input from Chris Franke, presented as a live album, supposedly taking from concerts in Albuquerque and West Berlin, but that was later confirmed to be a complete lie. The album was entirely thrown together in the studio as filler to fulfill their contract with Jive Electro, and much of it was even recorded after Franke had already left. I did not bother to hear that one. And there's other live projects with all new original material after that, such as 220 Volt Live. But I've covered all the important ones from their peak period, which are most often treated as proper canon main albums. Those needed to get some heavier focus. Anyway, we really need to speed things up a little since we're only like halfway through the releases I wanted to talk about, so what better way to do that than get into some of their soundtrack work? While I don't think soundtracks are quite as integral to the TD story as they are to, say, Vangelis, whose most famous works are all soundtracks, soundtracks are an unignorable part of Tangerine Dream's identity as well. They're arguably the band that did the most to popularize the idea of synth-based movie soundtracks. It's another obvious notable avenue through which a lot of people were introduced to the band in the first place, and of course, they composed an absolute shit ton of them. Some of the ones I did not listen to include 3 O'Clock High, Near Dark, Shy People, Miracle Mile, Canyon Dreams, that one got them their first Grammy nom, Dead Solid Perfect, The Park Is Mine, The Keep, Catch Me If You Can, and so many more. For this video, I'm primarily just going to stick to the soundtracks they released within the era up to my 1986 cutoff point. If I talk about all the ones they composed in that era, the list of releases to cover immediately doubles, but the ones they released in that era keeps the list down to a somewhat more manageable list of 8, and covers pretty much all the ones that people probably care about the most. Some of those are much more notable or important than others, and I should also disclose the fact that I have not seen a single one of the movies any of these soundtracks belong to. I'll just be talking about the music on its own. That does almost certainly mean none of these projects are likely to hit with as much impact as if I saw the movies, and I'll be missing that greater context, but I mean, do you see the length of this video already? I need to cut corners somewhere to retain my own sanity. But anyway, let's jump into these soundtracks, starting off with arguably the single most important one to mention, Sorcerer, their first soundtrack ever, released in 1977 while Peter Baumann was still on board. for the movie, directed and produced by William Friedkin, a passion project of sorts for Friedkin immediately following finding some success through some little-known art house film that nobody's ever heard of called The Exorcist. Friedkin was a big proponent of the use of synth themes in movies, having already just licensed out Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells to act as the main theme song for The Exorcist. But it was through that album, which also released on Virgin Records, that Friedkin discovered Tangerine Dream and realized they would be a perfect match for the kind of movies he wanted to make. Sorcerer is not a horror movie, but it is an exceptionally dark thriller / war-adjacent story from what I've read, loosely remaking an older movie from the 50s called The Wages of Fear, or at least basing itself off the same source material as that movie. When Edgar Froese first got the invitation to work on the score for Friedkin, he initially turned it down, thinking it was going to be for a sequel to The Exorcist, but when he found out what the movie was actually going to entail, he called Friedkin back. And interestingly, Friedkin did not give the band any video footage to work with, instead making the extremely unorthodox move of asking them to just base their compositions off their impressions of reading the script. And upon receiving the final product, he just immediately accepted what they had as is without asking for any changes. It was exactly what he wanted right off the bat. Made that simpler for the band, at least. Hope that wasn't too much of a pain in the neck for the movie's editors. While reviews of the movie were somewhat mixed, especially at the time of release, the album has since gone on to become something of a classic. Michael Jackson has supposedly gone on record calling this album a personal favorite of his. And in 2014, the band put out a full remake of the album called Sorcerer 2014 because of fucking course they did. Anyway, Sorcerer as an album is unsurprisingly very solid, and the odd manner in which it was commissioned did make it all the easier to work as a standalone album. It's pretty simple and straightforward for what it is, a lot of very dark and foreboding ambient compositions that closely followed the style the band was focusing on at the time, and coming the closest to the era when they first signed to Virgin with albums like Phaedra, a lot of extremely stripped-back synth arrangements that deliver some very low-key and heavy minor-key melodic elements from their usual sequencers and mellotrons, layering over each other with the occasional guitar solo or two. I don't really have a unique description for each of the 12 tracks here, but they all work very well for the specific mood they're going for. Some points of interest include the opening main theme, having no melodies and just being an abstract sea of shifting, creepy, dark ambience, some of the stronger and more memorable tunes showing up on cuts like Grind, and of course the movie's main theme, Betrayal. I like how The Journey incorporates some flute melodies, or how Rainforest just builds a load of creepy effects over a simple rhythmic bass arpeggio, which carries more than enough propulsion on its own. The track Vengeance has among the most tense dramatic heights, and there's the lengthier 7-minute cut Abyss, which brings in a lot of crunchy cello sounds and chaotically dissonant string breakdowns. Very trippy and otherworldly stuff. I mean, there's not a lot I actually have to say about the material on display here, but it is an all-around really effective listen, and all of it does really well capture that dark and foreboding mood in such a way that still holds up very well to this day, and still feels uniquely Tangerine Dream, able to stand on its own as an album outside the movie's original context. If you are a fan of the other albums released in the Peter Baumann era, and you've somehow missed hearing this one, it'll definitely be worth picking up. I'll give it a light 7.5 out of 10. Next up, their second soundtrack was for the 1981 movie Thief, directed by Michael Mann. This seems to be a slightly controversial moment from fans' reception. It was even nominated for a Razzie for Worst Musical Score that year. But as far as I'm concerned, there's nothing really wrong with it. It's just more stuff in the same vein as other albums they put out in the Johannes Schmolling era, so I assume it just has all the similar complaints that people level at albums like Exit, about moving too far in that comparatively more commercial style that actually made me a fan of the band to begin with. It's not nearly as good as Exit. At best, it feels like a collection of less important runoffs that wouldn't make the cut for that album. And the structuring is maybe a little odd, with moments here like the closer Igneous just being a retooling of Through Metamorphic Rocks from Force Majeure, other moments that apparently don't follow the score heard in the movie, or some cuts not even appearing in the movie at all, or the album containing two versions of the same theme in Beach Theme and its extended companion Beach Scene. Also, certain versions replace the latter with a different track called Confrontation, which TD did not compose at all and was instead handled by composer Craig Safan. I guess this isn't really the most essential of TD releases, but it is still generally a fun time in the same way their other releases from that era are, and works decently well enough as a standalone album, just sticking to their trademark style of bassy rhythmic arpeggios and bright melodic flares. Probably the biggest highlight here is the near 11-minute Diamond Diary, which hits on a similar feeling as their Quichotte live album did, just straightforward propulsion and progression. Scrapyard hits a pretty similar note pretty well too. I like some of the beeping melodies and acid-esque textures on Burning Bar, the heartwarming ambience of Trap Feeling, and the more slow burn dramatic pop approach to Beach Theme and Beach Scene, which have some good processed guitar solos. Very, very 80s. There's nothing here you absolutely need to go out of your way for on this project, or any moments that sit among the absolute best the band has to offer, or which I'd see myself keeping around. The actual Exit album obviously does all these ideas much better, but it'll do well if you're just looking for more stuff that sounds like that, and I will say I was enjoying myself the whole time anyway, enough so where I can just barely let it off with a solid 7 out of 10. Okay, picking up the pace a little bit now, their third soundtrack was for the science fiction film Wavelength in 1983. This marks the start of a bit of an unfortunate trend in some of TD's soundtrack albums. Thief had that one cut that retooled through Metamorphic Rock, so that had them realizing, hey, you know, we can just repackage our old stuff for these movies if they fit the mood right. So we get albums like this, nearly half of which is just retooled from other projects of theirs. Quichotte, Tangram, Exit, even one track pulling from Edgar's solo work, and one track that's just reprised from Thief. There are still nice original moments too, a cheery melodic tune using the Charons on synth settings in Mojave End Title, which appears twice on the album. A straight solo guitar piece called Alien Goodbyes that has a very wish you were here-ish quality to it. Airshaft has a lot of really intense bass stabs. Cairo Lab has some really dark and foreboding ambience. And the best track is probably Alley Walk, which has a melancholic atmosphere with lots of beeping effects that suitably evoke the deck of a spaceship and a dramatic change up near the end. But are any of these moments so amazing that they're really worth going out of your way for? Nah. It's a pleasant listen, as the vast majority of TD projects are, never tedious and certainly effective at providing a backdrop for a movie about aliens. Probably works great in that original context, but as a standalone album, this just doesn't work. There's too much reused material, and too many of the cuts are way too small and abortive for it to feel like anything of real substance. Unless you're a big fan of the movie, it's safe to skip this one. I'm feeling like a 5.3 out of 10. Okay, I am going to stop there for a moment. I need to give my throat a break. I'm gonna come back tomorrow and finish recording. How about that? Okay, new day of recording. I think I've sufficiently given my voice a rest. Next up, okay. With movies like Thief and Wavelength, I feel like these are the kinds of movies that still stick in people's memories to this day, specifically because Tangerine Dream were brought in to do the soundtrack. Maybe Sorcerer a little bit as well, albeit to a much lesser extent. They're movies where a lot of people, including myself, are likely to have found out about them through knowing TD did the soundtrack first. However, the next movie they contributed to the soundtrack of was Risky Business. Out of all the movies that TD composed for, this is almost certainly the one that most did the reverse of that, turned most people into Tangerine Dream fans who didn't know about the band before. This movie has a reputation behind it as a big classic of that era. It was the breakout role for Tom Cruise and the movie that first really turned that guy into a big star. It's the only one of these movies I definitely already knew existed before I got into TD myself. I'm not really equipped to talk about the full extent of the movie's cultural impact. Again, I have not seen the movie, and I'll be honest and say I don't plan to. Everything I've read about that movie sounds like it would be the kind of thing I would not enjoy watching. I'm an Ace Aero guy over here. But it's easily the movie TD were attached to that people still talk about the most and stuck the most in people's memories, where it was a really common entry point for people to have gotten into the band in the first place. Now mind you, if you were already a fan of TD beforehand, there's barely any reason at all to pick up the full soundtrack album for Risky Business, especially nowadays. Not only is half the album just the non-TD licensed tracks that appear in the movie, such as Bob Seger's Old Time Rock and Roll, Journey's After the Fall, Phil Collins' In the Air Tonight, etc., songs which probably didn't need Risky Business's help for people to know about. But the other half of the album, TD's actual score cues, most of them are once again just copied verbatim from their main albums. No Future is just a retitling of Exit, Guido the Killer Pimp is an edit of Cloudburst Flight, Lana is an excerpt of the title track from Force Majeure, and that leaves only 2 tracks out of the 11 on the entire album, which TD originally composed for this movie. Unless you were a fan of the movie first, being introduced to Tangerine Dream, listening to the full soundtrack album is completely pointless. However, one of those 2 original tracks is Love on a Real Train, the central theme tune which TD composed for the movie and has since become one of the band's most easily recognizable signature tracks, right up there with all the big familiar favorites from albums like Exit. It's an extremely simple track, nothing but very light melodic arpeggios, an understated ascending bass line, and a few delicate keyboard chords, but the tune created by these very spare elements is really striking and sticks in the mind very easily. Easy to see why it so quickly became one of TD's most popular tracks ever. It may even technically be the first Tangerine Dream track I became familiar with, although as I alluded to when I name-dropped the track in my Exit review, I was first introduced to it not through Risky Business, but through Global Communication, having covered it on their album 7614. Really, it was just a rejected remix of the track, which was originally made for one of TD's remix albums, but after TD turned it down, Global Communication decided to release it on their own, retitling it to 523. And I think they build those motifs into even more interesting territory on the full album, which stuck in my mind a lot more than TD's original ever did. Check out 7614 if you haven't, it's one of the all-time greats as far as 90s ambient techno goes. But I digress. The other original tune on this album is The Dream Is Always the Same, and honestly that track's very nice too. Hits a very similar note to Love on a Real Train, without being as catchy. A lot of pleasantly uplifting and bubbly layers of synths on that one. Those 2 individual tracks are definitely worth going out of your way to hear separately on your own time. There's just no reason to recommend the full album, and I will not be giving it a score for obvious reasons. Moving on from there, 1984 also saw the release of 2 more score albums from the band. First we got the movie Firestarter, an adaptation of a Stephen King novel. The movie's reception ranged from completely middle of the road to outright negative, and King has even disowned it, finding it flavorless thanks to producer meddling. Though TD's score for the movie seems to be remembered much more favorably. And it's nice, though mostly went in one ear and out the other for me. At least it's back to being fully original with no rehashes from other old releases, and this will certainly do you well if you're looking for that much smoother and more tender side of TD sound that was starting to come into play around the time with albums like Hyperborea and later Poland. Though the material actually on display doesn't really stick out to me that much in the greater context of their catalog. The one cue from this album I did really like was Charlie the Kid. That one has a really comforting and well-enveloping sound with all these fluttering electric pianos. Just feels really warm and fuzzy in a particular way that I don't typically get out of TD. The rest of the album has kind of a similar sound, but doesn't really have that strong tunes to back it up. I guess the tune behind Crystal Voice is nice, and there's some darker and more dramatic moments which were cool, like the whole run from Escaping Point to Between Realities. The latter does get a fair bit more tense and creepy than the rest of the album, but for the most part, it's just warm and pleasant background music. Which, to be fair, is exactly what it was designed to be, but as an album it does run together and doesn't really do anything to bring my attention that strongly. So, yeah, it's a decent listen, but inessential, feeling like a light 6.3 out of 10 on it. The last score album that technically still falls within the Virgin Years era, also released in 1984, was Flashpoint. A movie kind of more in like a neo-western action style, which also got mostly middling reviews. This score really isn't talked about much, and listening to it, it's very easy to see why. It just kind of sounds like a mix of all the other things they'd done through the first half of the 80s without delivering anything memorable to write home about. Again, at least the material isn't, like, directly rehashing the material from their old albums, but it may as well be. It's all just the same melodic arpeggio-driven mixes you've heard them focus on lots of other times without any of the actual tunes or even interesting textural flares to back it up. Just turning their unique sound into a by-the-numbers formula without providing any kind of twist. The most interesting thing to note about any of this stuff is the fact that the closer and title track is not performed by Tangerine Dream at all, but instead by a band called The Gems, which I'm not entirely sure is even a real band that exists. Their only credited song is this one, and it's also like a country rock song. It starts out sounding a little like TD, but then the singing comes in and turns it into something very different. Beyond that, the only other track that really stuck out to me in one way or another might be Mystery Tracks for those glacier electric pianos, which feels somewhere between a less good version of the beach theme from Thief or some of the more stripped-back parts of Firestarter. And yeah, that's it. The rest of the album is pure filler as far as I'm concerned, and it's it's just boring. Safe to skip, solid 5 out of 10 on this at best. Their next soundtrack, the first one in the Blue Years era, is Heartbreakers, released in 1985 between Poland and Le Parc, scoring a movie about a guy who paints porn or something like that. I don't care. Truth be told, after hearing Flashpoint and knowing the direction the band was heading in at this point, my expectations were dropping pretty low, but I had seen some people bigging this one in particular up in Discogs comments, so I listened to it out of curiosity. And actually, yeah, it's not half bad. I certainly like this one more than either Firestarter or Flashpoint. I'm not gonna say it's a keeper or anything, and there's no new stylistic direction here. It's once again all stuff you've heard them do loads of times before with all the usual bright melodies and arpeggios and 80s beats. The album basically sounds just like Le Parc, but like a better version of it. The alternate universe, if that album didn't feel quite so half-assed or shamelessly commercial and they put more heart into these tunes without making them feel so cheesy. Not to say this album doesn't also have its cheesy moments. Cuts like Pastime, The Loser, or Thorny Affair definitely remind me of the aspects of Le Parc sound I didn't like, and their brighter and more stock-sounding 80s beats and guitar soloing. The former of those has a pretty goofy blues chord progression, and the latter has some really dated slap bass. But the rest is pretty nice for what it is, be it more energetic moments like Twilight Painter, Gemini, or Daybreak, which hit decently hard and have solidly likable melodies, or the more common, quieter, and more contemplative emotional moments, see the title track, Footbridge to Heaven, or Rain in NY City. Even a few interesting ambient moments like the stripped-back solo keyboard piece Breathing the Night Away, or the track Desire, which starts out with like a full minute of solo pan flutes before a warmer arpeggio fades in underneath. I can't bring myself to call this album a must-listen by any stretch, and I doubt I'll be coming back to it, but I have seen a few people highlighting this soundtrack as one of their favorite TD releases ever, and as much as I disagree, I can at least kinda see where those people are coming from. I think an album like Thief is more likely to stick in my memory as a whole with tracks that feel a bit more distinct, but I will say this was pretty decent and pleasantly surprised me, so I'll give it a strong 6.7 out of 10. The last soundtrack the band released before my Underwater Sunlight cutoff point was for Legend in 1986, the fantasy movie directed by Ridley Scott starring Tom Cruise and Tim Curry. Mostly panned by critics at the time, although generally well-liked by audiences. Originally, this movie was going to be scored by Jerry Goldsmith, and more recent director's cut releases have his score instead. But apparently the president of MCA Records was at a test screening and told Ridley Scott he should bring in a more contemporary score to appeal to the youths more, pressing him to commission Tangerine Dream instead. Boy, how the tables have turned since William Friedkin was taking a big risk on Sorcerer, huh? With that said, the sound of this soundtrack is refreshingly very different from any of the other soundtracks I've been talking about. Ignoring the album opener, which is just a Brian Ferry song that TD had nothing to do with, this album still definitely sounds like TD. Johannes Schmolling hadn't quite yet broken off the band when this was recorded, and as such, the sound palette from his era is still easy to recognize. But the actual arrangements are getting way darker and more experimental with their arrangements than most of the stuff they were putting out around the time. The change in genre over to this fantastical fairy tale setting complete with a Lord of Darkness also translated in an equally big change in sound to match that setting. The melodies are really starting to evoke that Tolkien-esque medieval fantasy feel as heard on tracks like Cottage, Fairies, or The Dance. There's tracks which start to go a lot more out of the box in terms of their instrumentation outside of the usual synth settings. There's a lot more weird tribal percussion scattered all around, like on the fittingly extremely chaotic sounding Goblins, or the more peaceful Unicorn theme. The latter has some of those stock new age, like shakuhachi samples you've probably heard before, but they add to the effect quite well, I think. There's super dark and evil sounding synth choirs on tracks like Opening and Darkness. The latter also brings in some sitar melodies. Has me wondering whether or not Koji Kondo heard this soundtrack when he made the Bowser in the Dark World theme for Super Mario 64. Very similar energy to that kind of thing, albeit a lot more abstract and ambient. And the biggest surprise is probably Loved by the Sun, which is just straight up a collab with John Anderson of all people, the lead singer of Yes. He sings over another typically fantastical instrumental, which I think is a variation on the Unicorn theme, and it goes over as well as anyone could probably hope for it to go over, getting similar vibes to the Yes song To Be Over from their Relayer album, without the more monotonous aspects of that track. While I don't know if I'd really say Legend isn't necessarily an absolute must-listen or the kind of thing I'd see myself coming back to, It was a hell of a lot more interesting than I was expecting it to be. There's certainly an experience you can get out of this album that you're not going to get out of any of the other Tangerine Dream soundtracks I've just got done talking about. So, yeah, I'll say it's worth giving a shot if you're curious, and I'll give it a 7.3 out of 10. Now, that's mostly going to do it for TD's soundtrack work. I have a feeling if I went to all the later ones that released after the cutoff point, that would once again get monotonous really fast, and I think the ones I've already talked about demonstrate exactly why. But there's one last soundtrack which came out after their peak period, which I decided would probably be interesting enough to talk about, and a couple of people have specifically asked me about. In fact, what I believe to be the final soundtrack Tangerine Dream were ever commissioned for before Edgar's passing, and it's really not the kind of thing you'd ever expect them to be involved in. In 2013, Tangerine Dream were brought in to help compose the musical score for Grand Theft Auto 5, in collaboration with Woody Jackson, The Alchemist, and Oh No, also the score album being overseen and mixed by DJ Shadow. Now that is one hell of a crossover. Edgar had gone on record that video games were not typically his thing, big surprise there, but the idea of scoring a game like GTA 5 intrigued him due to its philosophy of working against the establishment and being a sort of social game. For what it's worth, I've never actually played GTA 5 myself. I come from more of a Nintendo family, though I suspect this score album may have also been another semi-common entry point for people much closer to my age to find out about and get into TD. Now, as for my thoughts on the score album, it's pretty good, though in a pretty unspecific way. The thing that really makes this thing interesting outside of the usual fare for these soundtracks is the heavier focus on rock and instrumental hip-hop elements, which the other artists outside of TD presumably bring. I should mention that Edgar also released a companion album of his own isolated contributions to the score called The Cinematographic Score GTA 5, which isn't otherwise interesting enough to merit being worth going out of your way for, but I did listen to for the sake of getting further insight into the final product. I mainly just bring it up since hearing that really reconfirmed my feelings that the final score was using the Tangerine Dream material as the primary base to build the compositions upon. Most of these tracks are building themselves around those standard synth-wavy progressions that have always been the band's trademark, with other guitars and hip-hop beats on top of it for extra texture. And it's also kind of interesting to note that more of the rock elements seem to be Edgar's contributions than you might expect. Now, once you get past the novelty of this crossover, the actual score album is generally enjoyable for what it is, but nothing particularly mind-blowing. A lot of the listening experience ran together for me, and there wasn't really anything in the way of big memorable theme tunes. There were some highlights for sure. I tended to like any of the tracks that brought in those Team Fortress 2 style horn sections, such as the opener We Were Set Up, or the Agency Heist, or Chop the Dog, among a number of others. The latter brought in some particularly nice sax solos. Some of the more synth-heavy compositions were fun and striking, like North Yankton Memories, You Forget 1,000 Things, or No Happy Endings, just in case you were forgetting Tangerine Dream was attached to this. There were a couple of instrumental hip-hop interludes that were clearly more The Alchemist and Oh No's doing, such as His Mentor or Therapy and Other Hobbies, which always particularly stuck out as highlights. Now, I think my favorite track here was probably Minor Turbulence, which is just a really propulsive and noisy rock instrumental. Just has a lot more flair and energy to it than many of these other compositions that made it really easy for me to get myself swept up in. That's about as deep as I can dig, though. Certainly the GTA 5 score album is a good time, gets the job done for what it's going for, and the novelty of the crossover between all these artists does inherently make it much more interesting than many of the other soundtracks I've been talking about. But beyond that, I wouldn't say anything here is an absolute must-listen or the kind of thing I see myself keeping around. On the merit of how much it breaks the mold for all the stuff I've been hearing for this video, I'm willing to let it get away with a solid 7 out of 10. I won't act like that big change of pace wasn't refreshing to have in this marathon, but my feelings on it aren't that strong. It's very light. 7, if that. Okay, now we're done talking about soundtracks. It's time to move on to other things. The last category of releases I want to talk about in this video and people had been asking me about is Edgar Froese's solo material. It's really something that this guy, in between how massively prolific Tangerine Dream already was, that he still had enough in him to put out solo albums on the side. Though the one nice thing is that in comparison to the upwards of hundreds of studio, live, soundtrack, and other releases that came out under the TD name, Edgar's solo catalog, specifically things he released under his own name and not Tangerine Dream, that adds up to a total of 7 albums. Not including one soundtrack album he did for Kamikaze 1989 and a bunch of loose compilations which I don't care about. That's way easier to digest and organize, and all but the last one were released in TD's peak Virgin Records era, so to hell with it, I just listened to all 7 of them. It's not like I saw myself doing a whole separate series for the guy, I just thought, well, let's just get it all out of the way and see what we get. I will not be talking about the solo projects of any of the other TD members. Chris Franke, Peter Baumann, and Johannes Schmoling, and many other former members have in-depth solo catalogs of their own, but fuck me, I cannot be bothered with all that. I think I've gone sufficiently above and beyond for this video covering all the things I have, and it only makes sense to make the exception for Edgar with, Tangerine Dream mostly being his vision above that of anyone else's. If I'm missing anything essential with other members' solo catalogs, feel free to let me know about it in the comments. I've generally heard good things about Peter Bauman's solo stuff. I will also note that I did stick to the original versions of all of Edgar's solo albums. Every single one of them but the last one saw fully retooled new versions re-recorded from the ground up in 2005 because of fucking course they did, but I avoided those. So first up, we got his debut album in 1974 called Aqua, released only a few months after Phaedra when Edgar felt like Tangerine Dream could probably use some extra funding to make sure they can still afford all this crazy synth equipment. Though in spite of that somewhat humble-sounding origin, somehow Edgar working mostly all by himself on this album results in roughly in-depth a listen as the albums the full band were putting out around the time, such as Phaedra or Atem or Sight. This could very easily work as a main TD album if you so wanted to treat it as such. I did really have to recalibrate my brain for this one, what with the wholly experimental ambient approach and how long it'd been since I'd been talking about any of their albums in this particular era. My videos on those albums were half a year ago at this point, but once I got myself in the right mood, I was like, okay, yeah, this is really good. 4 semi-lengthy tracks here, and each one of them feels like it's adding something of substance and has a cool idea behind it. I think the title track is probably the highlight, combining lots of languid ambient pads and squelching synth effects, as well as actual recordings of water sloshing around to create something that very much lives up to the aquatic vibe promised by the title, also featuring a decent bit of progression and interesting textures coming and going over at 17 minutes. If you want something a bit more traditionally musical, there's other cuts here like Panorphilia, which combines its wobbling bass synths with chilling mellotron solos, or NGC 891, which comes the closest to sounding like it'd fit at home on Phaedra, building slowly from abstract effects to fading in steady Moog bass lines, provided by Chris Franke, and other melodic soloing layering on top of it. I suppose creating a spacier effect, as that track's title promises. Edgar apparently utilized an artificial head system on this track where he put like 2 microphones in a dummy head in order to create some stereo depth effects, which is pretty neat. And finally, the album closes with Upland, which combines more bubbling synth effects with some pensive organ chords and melodies that call back to the sounds explored on the Alpha Centauri album. Not one of these tracks feels more important than another, and they all come together quite effectively as a whole. All in all, while I wouldn't say this album is necessarily preferable to the other projects the full band was putting out at the time, it comes way closer in quality to all those than one might expect, at least on par with something like Rubicon. Maybe if you're looking for something heavier on the melodies, it might not be the most fulfilling, but after all the work I've done on this video, getting something in this more experimental style was inherently refreshing, and it's clearly going to be an easier listen than something like Sight, despite that album going deeper with its ideas. Aqua expands upon those more experimental earlier works of the band, and takes those sounds into new territory that doesn't overlap with the main albums. And the results are really compelling, enough so where I might even see myself keeping it around. I can give this a very strong 7.5 out of 10. Next up we got Edgar's second album, Epsilon and Malaysian Pale, released in 1975. And this one seems to be widely considered his best solo work. Not only does it appear to be the most talked about one by a significant margin, I've seen a number of commenters on my previous TD videos specifically single it out and talk about their good memories with this one, which I have not seen for Edgar's other albums. But it's also the most consistently highly reviewed by more professional outlets. Pitchfork once put it on a list of the greatest ambient albums of all time. Not to mention David Bowie has even gone on record saying this album was a major influence on his Berlin era when he was putting out albums like Low and Heroes, calling the album the soundtrack of his life when he lived there. The hype behind this one is real, and after hearing it for myself, yeah, I pretty much immediately got where that hype came from and can in fact confirm this project is great. It was just instantly obvious why the album is as well loved as it is with one listen. The appeal of it was just right there on the surface. The appeal basically being, Mellotrons are fucking great. This album has 2 tracks, each taking up a full side of vinyl and based on places Edgar visited with the band while they were touring. The first side, the title track, is nothing but Mellotron and doesn't even really try to feel overtly electronic, but more like a modern classical or symphonic record, recreated with those very simple sonic ingredients. The Mellotrons imitating strings and woodwinds and just creating this heavily emotional and magical atmosphere inspired by his visit to a Malaysian jungle. More non-Mellotron synths do appear in a stretch in the middle through some extremely subtle rhythmic sequences, but for the most part it's just very flighty and atmospheric and loose without any kind of structure, and it's just extraordinarily pretty. The melodies and mood setting are just top-notch. The second side, Maroubra Bay, named after an area he visited in Australia, does bring in other synths in a much more obvious way that puts it closer to the kind of stuff the band were doing on Rubicon. Despite some dramatic Mellotron orchestral sounds in the intro and synth imitation oceans in the outro, most of it focuses on some very deep and satisfying Moog arpeggiated bass lines. At least I think it's Moog, whatever the bass lines were played on in Rubicon. And Edgar's doing some Mellotron keyboard soloing on top of it that ends up surprisingly decently catchy. I'll be honest and say, upon hearing this project, I did get stuck here for like 2 days with writer's block, not really knowing what to say about it, but I continued to listen to it repeatedly, and it's just continued to grow on me and hasn't gotten old yet after like 6 consecutive listens. The vibe created by all of it is just immaculate, and material like this is a prime reason why I've always been such a sucker for Mellotrons in general. It may not be the kind of thing that provides a lot of in-depth discussion material, but it was so immediately rewarding to the point where I have to say, this was my favorite project highlighted in this video by some distance, and I'm willing to give it an 8.3 out of 10. Next up, Edgar's third solo album is called Macula Transfer. Macula Transfer? Whatever. Released in 1976. This one might actually be the hardest album of his to find. Where all his other solo albums from this era saw a wider release through Virgin, this one only saw a limited release through Brain Records and never even officially saw a CD release outside of his remixed, like, Taylor's version in 2005. It did see an unofficial CD through Mannequin Records, but as they didn't get Edgar's permission, they were threatened with legal action and had to pull it from sale, so that's not ideal. On the other hand, having heard the album, I will have to say, you're not really missing an Epsilon and Malaysian Pale level gem here. After those first 2 solo records felt so fully formed and like they had some greater ambition to actually match the main TD albums, it was a little deflating to get to this album, which was his first solo record that actually came off to me like a side project. It's a collection of random tunes that he composed to pass the time while on-board airplane rides for tours. Each of the 5 tracks is named after an airplane's flight number. And I mean, they're all nice and pleasant. There's lots of nice Mellotron soloing and guitar soloing. It pretty much recaptures the vibe of an album like Stratosphere without any of the tighter structuring. More obviously improvisational take on that album's general sound palette. And technically each of the tracks has an identity. OS452 has more acoustic guitar plucking, AF765 and Quanta 611 have a few weirder and more experimental flares, like manipulated voices or atonal dark ambience. And PA701 and IF810 focus more on the underlying rhythmic synth arpeggios for the more overtly electronic sound. The latter of those is definitely the most stratosphere-sounding cut of all of them. But, like, that's about as deep as this album goes. It's really not that interesting, and most of it just kind of feels like indistinct, aimless meandering. Granted, that could also just be as easily turned around into a selling point. I have heard people say they weren't as keen on an album like Stratosphere specifically because it felt like it was more planned out ahead of time. So for the people who, like, steadfastly stand behind TD's improvisational work, I could easily see this working as a more natural version of similar ideas, getting the vibe without the structuring that bothered them. But as much as I may like that deserted vibe of Stratosphere, it was that tight structuring and the greater focus on forming more memorable hooks that actually elevated it into great territory for me and made it feel like that much more of a landmark release for them. Getting to an album that sounds like it, but without any of that more carefully planned tightness, feels like it's almost kind of missing the point a little, which leaves my feelings on this very much mirroring my feelings on the Encore live album. That album's grander in scale and more exciting, so it probably barely gets the edge for me, but this is also half the length and thus a fair bit easier to get through, so I think it evens out to me enjoying them roughly the same amount. Macula Transfer is generally a nice listen for what it is. If you want more stuff that sounds like that early era of TD, you'll get more of that. But none of it is absolutely essential. There's not really anything here that you couldn't hear done better, either out of his last 2 solo albums or those other main TD albums from this era, and I'm feeling a 6.7 out of 10 on it. Next up, his 4th solo album is called Ages, released in 1978. This one's much easier to find and much better remembered than Macula Transfer, back to retaining the more well-loved classic status that his first 2 solo albums enjoy. And it's also much bigger in scale, a double LP originally stretching on for over 80 minutes, split over 9 tracks. If I'm not mistaken, this might actually be the longest project I'm covering in this video, like barely by like 1 minute or something. And CD versions even had to cut the last track out for it to fit in that format. Thankfully, unlike other albums I've covered in this video around that length, that doesn't actually translate to nearly as tedious a listen as you might think. In fact, I think it turned out to be really damn solid. As for what it sounds like, this album did release a few months before Cyclone, so the sound and instrumental palette of that album actually carries over to this pretty clearly, but without any of the parts of that album that proved to be more controversial. There's obviously no vocals, and there's no sections that feel like they're almost directly ripping from certain tracks on Pink Floyd's Wish You Were Here. A lot more of it comes closer to cuts like Madrigal Meridian, and in fact I think a bit from this album was even repurposed into that track. We're not quite on the level of punchy immediacy as seen on an album like Force Majeure, but it's kinda like the parts of Cyclone that felt like a prototype of the sound that would lead into that album, combining some pretty hard-hitting, bright, and blaring melodic synth instrumentals with some of Klaus Krieger's prog rock drumming. And all of it went over pretty well without ever running together too much. Also, surprisingly enough, a lot of it was carried by each of these tracks having a strong tune behind them. I say surprisingly, since Edgar's talent for melody writing has always struck me as hit and miss at best. I always felt like other members of TD, such as Johannes Schmoling, did more to carry that weight, where Edgar has a tendency to not really put much thought into what he's playing, and just kind of melodically vibe over his keyboards rather than actively try to construct hooks. Macula Transfer is a prime example of how that style can end up not as compelling, and minor spoilers, it won't be the last example of that in his solo catalog. This is an album that easily had the potential to go wrong with how all these tracks stick to the same sound palette, though most of these tracks sink into decently catchy melodic patterns that are well constructed enough to be able to set themselves apart in context, purely through the tunes and the emotional quality they carry. You can get the super cheerful and triumphant 11-minute epic opener Metropolis, or a heavier slow burn like Icarus that has a particularly strong bass line and some solid synth trumpet riffs, the driving and propulsive grooves of Nights of Automatic Women, the particularly flashy lead melodies of Children's Deeper Study, which aren't really developed upon much but are still just strong enough to carry the track. Sometimes the textures can do more of the work though, like all the Mellotron flute sounds going through Era of the Slaves, or the particularly austere synth oboe and harpsichord arrangement on Ode to Granny A that can nail down their marginally darker moods quite well. Or penultimate cut Pizarro and Atahualpa, which kind of feels like it's using the synths to imitate an Indian raga, sampled hand percussion that isn't quite tablas, and electric guitar soloing that isn't sitar, but the effect is kind of the same, and it's pretty neat. And speaking of guitar soloing, that's also a big focus on the album's actual closer, Golgotha and the Circle Closes, which is the closest this album comes to leaning into that Pink Floyd influence again, with how the beats are structured and the way some of the synth builds come in around it. But the way they go against Edgar's guitar soloing feels much too bright and hopeful and major key for that influence to ever become distracting. Makes for a really strong finish to the album with a neat little hidden track snuck in at the end that kinda mirrors the way the album started. Oh, and of course, I can't be forgetting the 20-minute kinda not really centerpiece track, Tropic of Capricorn, which is probably the best cut here. The way it evolves through like 3 different moody sections, and especially that section in the middle with a classical piano was really damn cool. Though even this isn't my favorite by a huge margin or anything, all the other tracks feel like they can sit around a comparable level of quality. I'm not going to say I think this album quite reaches greatness, if only because there's clear examples of other albums in the TD catalog that focuses on very similar ideas and just have so much more of an immediate wow factor and present them in that much tighter a package. Especially Force Majeure and Tangram, but especially Force Majeure. Not to mention, even if I feel each track on here has its own identity, I would be lying if I said I didn't think it ran together at least a little bit, or that I would often miss when any number of them began or ended, even though none of them are trying to segue into each other. But again, this is only my justification for why this album isn't in the 8 range for me. It's still really damn good, and at no point in my 5 or so listens of this thing was I ever feeling the length. That Jeanne d'Arc album I covered earlier in this video was a few minutes shorter than this, but felt at least a half hour longer. This one paces itself perfectly and makes those 83 minutes feel like a perfectly reasonable length for an album. A welcome reminder of why I typically prefer longer albums like this in the first place for having that greater amount of substance. As uniform as the sound of this album is, the execution is well done enough with just enough variety to make it work anyway, and hearing this may have also gotten Cyclone to further grow back on me more in retrospect. I was already kind of feeling like I may have been too harsh on that album not too long after I posted my review, but hearing the similarity in sound between moments from this album and those most blatantly Pink Floyd-y moments of Bent Cold Sidewalk, with their similar triumphant synth fanfare kind of aesthetic, sort of helped me appreciate what I could get out of listening to Cyclone, what I couldn't get out of listening to Wish You Were Here. And in any case, this album is definitely better than Cyclone, so do make sure to check it out if you are a fan of that era of TD. I'm overall feeling a very strong 7.7 out of 10 on it. Okay, moving on. Solo album number 5 is called Stuntman, released in 1979. Sonically and stylistically, this is pretty much in the same vein as Ages, with much less of the rock edges. It's kind of trying to do that similar instrumental synthpop style as eventually heard on something like Tangram. Also presenting itself in a much tighter and more accessible package, 6 tracks spread out over 44 minutes. Ages did prove Edgar had it in him to get an album like this to work, though I had no idea what to expect out of it. And it turns out the album near entirely fell into the background and left pretty much no impression. Okay, so you know how I was talking earlier about Edgar's songwriting style tending towards melodically vibing and that he's not good at coming up with hooks? Exhibit A of that right here. With the sole exception of the opener and title track, which assembles a pretty nice little cheerful major key synth pop tune, the rest of the album is just a lot of winding improvisation without any particular structure or direction, winding through lots of different familiar sounds that so many other albums later in the TD catalog would focus on and significantly improve upon. I suppose you can give this album credit since it came out in 1979 and thus predates the entire Johannes Schmolling era, predictive of the classics to come and setting down that sonic foundation to build upon, but it's also clearly not as good as any of those classics. And not all the albums in the Johannes Schmolling era were good, but all of them had hooks and felt like they had a specific direction. This album remains mostly stagnant throughout and floats through lots of arpeggios, pads, lead melodic steps, and other synth melodies that, while all perfectly pleasant and setting a generically warm and comfortable mood, don't really feel like they carry any particular meaning. And having heard so many other better albums that sound just like it don't do enough to grab my attention in their own right. Not to say there's absolutely nothing else of interest here. The 2 tracks around 10 minutes long were pretty decent. It Would Be Like Samoa has a number of mildly interesting progressions to go through to justify its length. Although that one mainly just stuck out to me because I immediately recognized some of those drill-like synth pads in the intro as the exact ones that Boards of Canada would directly sample about 20 years later when they made their track XYZ. And for the record, that would also significantly improve upon the original to the point where the sound of that sample may as well just belong to Boards of Canada now, but I digress. And the other track I thought was kinda nice was maybe Drunken Mozart in the Desert, mainly just for that whole section in the last 3-4 minutes, which has a pretty nice triumphant major key synth build-up. It's decently epic in a way that would kinda get my attention, I guess. But any of the other tracks, Detroit Snack Bar Dreamer, a Dali-esque Sleep Fuse, or Scarlet Score for Mescalero. I mean, okay, I kinda like the goofy overlong track titles, but I can't really meaningfully tell any of them apart or really get myself to care about what's going on. And that's the full extent of the substance I feel like I can glean out of this thing. As usual, at no point was I turned off by what I was hearing. All of it was generally nice and pleasant to have on and doesn't yet have any of the obnoxiously commercial sheen that would start to color the TD projects from the era after their contract with Virgin expired. But the material here is just so unremarkable and by the numbers as far as Tangerine Dream related stuff goes, so much so that I can't even really sink myself into the vibe of it all that effectively. It all feels way too plain and flavorless. Geez, I'll even go to bat for White Eagle more than this, since despite having somewhat similar feelings on both albums, being inoffensive but inessential collections of more of what you'd already expect out of TD, I still remember what each of the tracks on White Eagle sound like. I'm not going to remember anything on here after I put up this video aside from the Bitboards of Canada sampled, and even just trying to remember anything else immediately after listening only puts parts of Tangram in my head instead. I know I'm probably going against the grain with this one, and it appears to be well remembered by fans. The fact that I've only gotten to it after I've heard all these other similar projects in the TD catalog was absolutely detrimental to my feelings, and that obviously won't be applicable to the people who actually heard it when it came out. But you could say the exact same thing about Ages, and that album holds up way better where this one just strikes me as boring. Yeah, sorry to say, but I think this one's safe to skip, and I'm feeling a 5.3 out of 10 on it. Anyway, solo album number 6 is called Pinnacles, although this one didn't come out until 1983, right around the same time as Hyperborea, and would also be Edgar's last solo album on Virgin, as well as the last solo album he would release for over 20 years. In one breath, a lot of the same things I said about Stuntman also apply to this album. It's 4 more tracks of Edgar's improvised melodic vibing and sticking firmly to the style the full band were already focusing on in that era without any special twists to set it apart. Especially once the Poland Live album came around later, this sits within the same ballpark as the material on there. With that said, this was nowhere near as much of a snooze fest as Stuntman. The album's not incredible by any stretch, and there's nothing here that an album like Hyperborea doesn't already do significantly better, but at least here the meandering was well executed and full-sounding enough for me to actually be able to sink myself into the vibe it was trying to create. And even if the melodies aren't really trying to form hooks, they do actually nail down a decently strong emotional connection. There was a warmer sentimentality to the material here I could pretty easily get into, like if everything on White Eagle was as good as the title track from that album. And also as a nice plus, I can tell the 4 tracks apart from each other. 9-minute opener Specific Gravity of Smile hits you with a sparse intro of bass and flute synths that sort of sound like the soundtrack to a western movie before evolving into lots of glittering arpeggios of varying texture, but continually sounding quite bright and uplifting. The Light Cone is the tightest and most pop-friendly cut, not unlike the title track from Stuntman, about equally as solid and cheerful a tune and even better produced. Walkabout runs through more driving bass lines and eerie string pads for 7 minutes, which is decently exciting and cinematic feeling. And of course, probably the biggest highlight is the 22-minute title track, which evolves through 3 separate movements. The first 8.5 minutes stick to some brisk MIDI programmed beats and keeps its arpeggios more on the understated side. The next section, running up through around the 15-minute mark, has lots of triumphant major key beatless build-ups and more bubbly melodies, and the final section switches key and goes back to a more driving and mildly epic sound that sort of mirrors the tone of the way the album started. Again, I won't say any of this stuff is like new all-time favorites or among the best I've ever heard out of any TD-related projects, but it's at least pretty good. I think I enjoyed it roughly on par with the Poland Live album. That obviously had a lot more substance to dig into, but this is much tighter and better produced. It's a nice little album that I enjoyed my time with, and I'm willing to give it a 7.3 out of 10. And that leaves Edgar's 7th and final solo album, Dalinetopia, in 2005, coming off the heels of throwing together all those remix versions of his previous solo albums to re-release on his Eastgate label that year. He decided, what the heck, I'm in the mood for doing one more. So he put together this album as a tribute to his old friend Salvador Dali, supposedly inspired by the invisible reality behind a painting and the way that art can reach a certain level of the subconscious, or something like that, whatever. Being an album released in the mid-2000s and designed for the CD format, it is a decent bit longer than most of his other solo albums, and sitting around 70 minutes total. Also, as kinda stands to reason given TD's reputation at the time, virtually nobody talks about this album these days. I'm not gonna say I was exactly going into this with high expectations, but I just kinda jumped in hoping to get something passable enough. And something passable enough is exactly what I got. Actually, not gonna lie, I mean, I went into this half expecting this to be his worst solo album, and it is definitely not that. It's actually pretty good. At least as long as you have a stomach for that new agey side to the later period TD sound. This ended up working for me kind of in a similar way to a TD album like Mars Polaris. And while it's definitely not as good as that one, it can hit on that spacey and atmospheric appeal pretty well, all things considered. And even containing some decent sonic variety as well. There's a couple of atmospheric drum and bass tracks like opener Dale Hiroshima or Dale Erotica, which combines those fast-paced skittering beats with more synth choirs. The track Dali Esquador got a lot more epic and propulsive with its synth builds. The track Da Luna had some pretty dang kick-ass guitar soloing. And the closer and title track ended up working in the vein of like a darker trip-hop instrumental sort of cut. Really nice subtle atmosphere created by that one that has a nice build to it as well. And I think my favorite cut here was the 9-minute Da Luminacion, which brought in a lot more MIDI pianos for something of a mild classical-inspired flavor that ended up hitting a pretty nice emotional note as well. I don't actually have anything else to break down with this material beyond that. There are 4 other tracks that just keep up the pleasant vibe in a way that didn't strike me as memorable, and it probably won't surprise anyone to hear you're not going to get much in the way of actual hooks. TD's catalog from this era had a lot of stuff that sounded exactly like this, and I don't know if it would have stood out to me if I didn't hear it with the exact timing I did, with this 2000s New Age approach being a decently refreshing change of pace from the more stripped-back and plain 80 synths of his last 2 solo albums. Jeanne d'Arc sounds exactly like this album, for instance, and if I had tried to hear this immediately after that, I kinda doubt I would have had quite as much patience for it. I kinda doubt I'm going to be listening to this again once I put out this video, but I'll still take it anyway, honestly. Even if my expectations were low and easy to surpass, I'll still say it was a pleasant surprise all the same, and I enjoyed it for what it was. Enough so where I'm just willing to let it off with a solid 7 out of 10. Alright, so now that we're finally through all of that, we've talked about TD's studio career arc, their most popular live albums and soundtrack albums, and every single one of Edgar Froese's solo albums. I think that leaves only one last topic to cover for this video, so I guess we have to finish by talking about the band's most recent output. If you may recall the segments of this video like 20 billion years ago when I was still talking about the band's studio output and breaking down the various eras of their career, I left out the final era of the band's career, the Quantum years, which came after the Eastgate years and officially kicked off in 2014 when the band put out a mini-album called Malacunia, which I didn't listen to in full, I just kind of previewed through it, but was notable for the inclusion of a new member of the band to join Edgar Froese and Thorsten Quachening, and that new member was none other than Ulrich Schnaus of all people. Yes, the same Ulrich Schnaus who made all-time down-tempo synth classics of his own, like Faraway Trains Passing By and A Strangely Isolated Place. He became a full-time member of the band. With the addition of a cult favorite legend like him to the band's lineup, TD saw a bit more consistently favorable reviews and press than they had in quite a long time. And Edgar got the idea for a possible new album series which would translate current knowledge of quantum mechanics into sound, or knowing him just kinda loosely base itself around the concept. But unfortunately, before said series could get off the ground, in January 2015, after suffering a pulmonary embolism, Edgar Froese suddenly passed away at age 70. I was paying attention at the time, and I vividly remember the shock and sadness from hearing of his death. More people were talking about Tangerine Dream and the memories of all their game-changing classics and nostalgic favorites around then than I'd seen in any other time I'd been following them. It was heartbreaking to hear. Though, having already known about the band's full career arc and their decades of, let's say, less interesting material, there was a part of me who at least felt like I could take some comfort knowing the band would be finally seeing a long overdue closed-up end to its story. So, when I caught wind that the band was continuing on anyway without Edgar and a full posthumous album came out in 2017 called Quantum Gate, I was actually livid. I was thinking like, are you fucking kidding me? Why the fuck is this band still going? Have they not already suffered long enough from all the years of pointless cash grabs and flooding the market with the same stuff over and over? Why do we need this? Jerome Froese had even previously gone on record on social media saying that Tangerine Dream essentially was his dad, and that with his dad's passing, the band is dead to him as well. That he had no plans to ever support anything called Tangerine Dream that would be continuing on without him. And at the time, I fully agreed with Jerome. I specifically opted not to cover Quantum Gate when it came out, and I figured I would never be addressing anything the band released after Edgar's passing. Not really out of feeling that they were necessarily disrespecting or exploiting Edgar, since Edgar did purportedly specifically ask for them to finish what he started and continue the band without him before he died, which did track. That sounded like the kind of thing he would ask for. But more out of a feeling that these projects were just doing more to further extend or even worsen the unhealthily stagnant state of the band, forcing the Tangerine Dream name to suffer longer. And when I first set down my plans to do this series in the first place almost 2 years ago now, I'd initially planned to continue to not address this stuff, or at best contain my thoughts to a rant about its existence without actually hearing it. So, as for why I've ended up deciding to cover these projects for this video anyway, well, there's a few reasons. I'll admit my longtime knee-jerk apprehension with the existence of this entire Quantum Years era has mainly stemmed from my complicated fandom of a completely different band who were sort of TD's contemporaries, and that's the prog band Yes. Now that's another band who's also seen a particularly rough career arc. I'd argue their story got way worse, with a particularly big fall-off point around the mid-later 80s and especially through the 90s. They had the opportunity to send their career off on a high note with Fly From Here in 2011, but after that album, they've just kept embarrassing themselves with painfully mediocre comeback attempts over and over and over, and following them has been nothing short of excruciating. Heaven and Earth, The Quest, Mirror to the Sky, Steve Howe just refuses to let this band die despite the fact that he's the only core member of the band left from when they were at their heights, and everyone else from that peak has either left in aggravation or, in the case of Chris Squire and Alan White, also actually died. Anytime Yes announced a new album in the past decade, I wanted to fucking reach through the internet and grab Steve Howe by the lapels and scream at him to please, for the love of God, stop releasing new music. Perhaps it is due to that trauma of being a longtime Yes fan and seeing possible parallels in the shape of the Tangerine Dream career arc. I always had the fear that TD would end up suffering the same painful fate. Maybe even more fearful of that possibility given how ridiculously many more albums this band has released. But the more time has passed, the more I started to feel like maybe TD's current situation isn't nearly as similar as I'd initially believed. For one thing, when Yes release a new album in this day and age, the vast majority of the fanbase has the exact same reaction as I do of please fucking stop, and every failed comeback attempt they make gets the critical thrashing it deserves. TD's posthumous albums, meanwhile, have seen unilaterally positive reviews from everyone who didn't put their foot down like I did and bothered to actually hear the results. Both fans and critics love them. I've even seen comments in my previous videos in this series talking about how much they love these albums in particular, and I think I even saw Fantano giving their last album, Raum, a minor shout around the time it was coming out. That's not exactly the reaction I would typically expect for a band in this supposed zombie state. I also started to get my first personal change of heart about the idea of covering these last year, or right before this series actually started, when I did my video on the commercial trance artist Schiller. I got to hear that guy collaborate with Thorsten Quationing multiple times in some of his most recent albums, including one ostensibly labeled as a collaboration between Schiller and Tangerine Dream, and I ended up really liking that stuff. Especially the Quationing collab on Schiller's 2021 album Summer in Berlin called Dem Himmel so nah. Hearing that had me like, damn, this is actually great. Maybe I've had the wrong idea about Thorsten Quationing. Maybe his acting as the new bandleader for TD could theoretically work after all. On top of all that, the longer time I've been spending on this series, examining the history of Tangerine Dream and all its various soaring heights in this sea of tedious lows and pointless nothing albums, the more I have started to think about Edgar Froese's style of direction and his particular creative impulses, and I eventually had to make the possibly blasphemous question myself: how sacrosanct is Edgar's direction really? As talented a musician as Edgar was, as unquestionably visionary as he was at a point in time, and as dependent on his direction as the band always was from the start, it was also through his direction and vision that the band went in the middling sellout direction it did over the course of multiple decades. It was his decision to put out so many albums and unnecessarily flood the market, and a lot of those albums are just unquestionable attempts at shallow nostalgia-bait cash grabs. Especially the number of times Edgar attempted to sort of lazily George Lucas the old classic albums. The guy himself was clearly not above treating his own band's legacy somewhat irreverently with the intention purely to do with capitalism. Additionally, I kinda disagree with Jerome's assessment that Tangerine Dream simply is Edgar Froese. Like, I get what he means. Like, it was obviously Edgar's band more than anyone else's, but what about all the other dozens of members? What about Chris Franke? What about Peter Baumann? What about Johannes Schmoling? Hell, what about Jerome himself? There was a point where he was kind of taking primary creative reins for the band as well, and some full TD albums are more Jerome's work than Edgar's, even if it wasn't exactly the most critically well-received era. Edgar may have been the one at the steering wheel the whole time, but we can't just act like other people weren't absolutely crucial in shaping what TD were, or that the success of all those classics wasn't significantly helped along by the input of those other members filling in for Edgar's clear weaknesses as a solo artist. Tangerine Dream is still, at the end of the day, a band. A collective, a group. So it's not that out of the question for other members to take a bit more charge without being dishonest about calling it Tangerine Dream. I also look at the state of the band after Edgar's passing 9 years ago. They've released 2 albums, a couple of EPs, and a bunch of tapes of their live concerts. Compared to what Edgar was putting out under the TD name in the late 2000s, that's almost nothing. Honestly, a perfectly reasonable amount of music for any band to be releasing over that span of time. And the more I looked into it, the less and less it struck me as an attempt to further milk his legacy. So that had me thinking, maybe these posthumous albums are trying to be the more dignified send-off to the band that I wanted. If Edgar were alive to see his full vision for the Quantum Years through, there's a real possibility that these 2 albums we've seen released could have been stretched out to like 12 albums or something, and gotten really tiring. So keeping the band's output more limited like they have is probably for the best. And the buzz around them seemed to be suggesting that these albums actually were a big step up from the TD output at the end of the Eastgate years leading up to it. So, with all of those mental barriers broken down, I decided, alright, fine. Let's see what these posthumous albums are like. I know Thorsten Quachening has proven himself to be a talented guy in his own right, and I was already a big fan of Ulrich Schnauz. How bad can it possibly be if someone like him got involved in all this? So I sat down, braced myself, and finally listened to Quantum Gate, hoping all the fan and critical praise would actually be warranted. And okay, yeah, I can confirm this is really good. And the results do not just rotely sound like how you'd expect. There's a sound in this album that does not remind me of any other previous TD albums. It seems the invitation of Ulrich Schnauz into the band inspired Edgar to get more ambitious than he had in several decades. And I can confirm going in this direction had to be at least partially Edgar's idea, since I've previewed through the Malacunia project, which came out while he was still alive, and it sounds very similar to this. Even if the musical ingredients, like the typical synth arpeggios and pads and beats and occasional guitar soloing and whatnot, are familiar to the usual TD formulas, the energy level of this material is way higher than you would expect. This stuff is trying to sound huge, grand in scale, and epic. There's a consistent sense of propulsion and drive and heaviness that hasn't been present in TD's work since at least the early 80s, if not just as far back as projects like Force Majeure and Ricochet. In fact, I'm getting similar vibes off of this material that I do listening to the more recent work of an artist like Asura, who combines his 70s synth influences with psytrance and other more modern dance formulas and the like. I will say I don't think this album quite reaches proper greatness for me, if only because the 9 tracks on this thing are difficult to tell apart from each other, and slightly run together once again. Not every single one of these cuts adds something specific to the table that no other track does, or gives me something to say, and tracks such as, say, Proton Bonfire, or especially Non-Locality Destination, among others, can feel a little filler-ish in context. But there's still definitely a solid selection of big highlights, like the 13-minute epic opener Sensing Elements, which starts out like a modern, polished, minimal techno production, but builds up to lots of epic heights, or the much more psytrance-ish Roll the 7 Twice, which has build-ups that consistently feel like they're about to hit some really hard-hitting drop, although said payoffs are a lot more sentimental and atmospheric and oddly satisfying in their own separate ways. While Hoshiko Yamane's violin playing, when present, is usually so buried in the mix that it would require multiple listens for me to even notice it all on certain tracks, she does get a more obvious chance to shine and add a more emotional edge alongside some nice piano textures on the surprisingly dark and foreboding closer, Genesis of Precious Thoughts. That track was originally the opener of a teaser EP that came out 2 years prior called Quantum Key, which has 3 other tracks that do not appear here, if you want to look into that. And as for the very best tracks, I think actually my single favorite track in the bunch was the only one that didn't feature Edgar's contributions at all. Being It Is Time to Leave When Everyone Is Dancing. The major key melodic flares and atmospheric paths just feel so much brighter and more uplifting and more well-defined than any other track here, in such a way that would consistently stick out to me, really hitting on that specific sound that made me fall in love with Ulrich Schnauz's solo albums back in the day, and hits a raw emotional note unmatched anywhere else on the album. Although the following track, Identity Proven Matrix, is a very close second favorite, given it's probably the track that comes the closest to having an actual hook, with those minor key melodic stabs and even some little synth strings. It feels like it's sticking to more of a verse-chorus structure, and those build-ups and payoffs are absolutely incredible. Fittingly enough, I think at the end of all of this, I came out of this album with very similar feelings as I did when I came out of the solo album Ulrich Schnauz put out the year prior and I reviewed back when that came out, No Further Ahead Than Today. That was another album that mostly just stuck to one singular sound without much variety, but was still able to notch an honorable mention on my year-end list for 2016 for how well executed that sound was and how much it could get me swept up in the astoundingly pretty mixes of propulsively atmospheric guitars and synths. And I think I enjoyed the more electronically focused sound of this album a little more than I did the sound of that album as well. It feels like Edgar was gearing up to take the band into a bold new direction, the likes of which we hadn't seen since the band was still signed to Virgin Records, one that very much sounds like Tangerine Dream without ever sounding like shallow nostalgia bait. I wouldn't go so far as to say Quantum Gate is one of the best things I've ever heard from the band, but it very easily beats out anything the band had been putting out for a very long time. The kind of thing that almost leaves you wishing that you could see what could have been were Edgar still alive to see this new chapter for the band through, what with how much it ironically seems to be looking ahead to the future. And in any case, very much shut me up as a former naysayer to the existence of this entire era. I'm feeling a very strong 7.7 out of 10 on it. But now we're through all of that. That leaves the band's as of now most recent studio album, Raum, released in 2022. At this point, Ulrich Schnauz had left the band to go do his own things once again, leaving the lineup to be Thorsten Quachening, Hoshiko Yamane, and a brand new addition in pianist Paul Frick, which is still currently the lineup of the band right now. This was another album that when it dropped I was still very apprehensive of its existence for all the reasons I've already gone through, and a lot more so with this one since unlike Quantum Gate, which Edgar had clearly already done a lot of work for and had a particular vision set in stone before his passing, this album at least from the outset looked more to actually be an attempt to carry on the band without Edgar. Featuring only 3 tracks out of a total of 7, with his contributions pulled from old demos and outtakes he had locked away in the archives, with some apparently dating all the way back to the 70s. The existence of such a project always felt very strange and questionable to me, but once again looking at it for this video I have had to remind myself that A. Edgar himself would likely not have been above carrying out such an idea from a commercial standpoint, B. Thorsten Quachening did already have full creative control over a fair bit of material in the band while Edgar was still alive. As already mentioned, there's plenty of TD tracks composed by him alone without Edgar going as far back as the mid-2000s, so it does still make sense for this band to still be called Tangerine Dream despite now acting under his leadership. And C, again, Edgar may have specifically wanted for this to happen, or at the very least was cool enough with the idea to give his blessing for Quachening to take over before he died. So even if it inherently feels weird for this to exist, it's not like there's any actual disrespect going on here. And once again, all the reviews I've seen of this album from people who heard it were overwhelmingly positive as well. I'd even heard buzz that they were going to be continuing to try some fresh ideas on this album that you wouldn't necessarily be hearing on previous albums, which was somewhat intriguing. So, sure, I ended up mostly agreeing with the hype for Quantum Gate, so let's see if I agree with the hype for this one as well. And, well, I will first say I did not enjoy this as much as Quantum Gate, but it is very interesting to note that this album feels way more easily recognizable as Tangerine Dream than that one. I've seen professional reviews describe Quantum Gate as a throwback to older sounds, while this felt more like a look ahead to the future for the band, but I would actually argue the exact reverse of that. Quantum Gate felt a lot more to me like a creative re-energizing and looking ahead to the future with a bold new style that TD hadn't yet explored before in quite that same way, one that Edgar just unfortunately happened to not live to see through to the end. While Raum feels much more specifically throwback-like, it has a lot more sonically in common with the things they were doing throughout the 2000s Eastgate years, and feels a lot more designed like a look back on everything Tangerine Dream has ever been through its entire history. Chances are, if you scroll through their history, you'll find a lot of projects that sound very similar to this one. However, if there is one thing that does set this project apart in particular from their usual fare, it's the emotional quality of it. Especially coming off the heels of Quantum Gate, which was so big and epic and propulsive, this album is way more low-key, bittersweet, and somber, evoking both the imposing vastness as well as the loneliness of space, as per the title. And also, unlike many of their other old projects, I feel like each of the 7 tracks here does a good job of nailing down their identities and context, even if all of them are going for the same general tone. There's something of a somber tone to the melodies right off the bat as we walk into the delicate arpeggiated keyboard lines on the opener Continuum, going up next to its foot-tapping but stripped-back beats that feel rather melancholic, or the similarly minimalistic synth sequences on Portico, evolving into lots of airy synth choirs. The other 3 comparatively shorter tracks all have their own interesting little ideas, like how You're Always on Time initially builds itself out of minimal IDM percussion and MIDI upright bass textures before building itself into the usual synths and including a few odd incorporations of string sections. Or how Along the Canal brings in a lot of very pretty woodwind and flute sounds to float around in the background and gets particularly dark and dramatic sounding. As simple as those melodic sequences are, there is an interestingly, kinda despairing tone to that one. And that contrasts well with the comparatively more positive and driving tones of What You Should Know About Endings, which occasionally features some runs of fast-paced MIDI xylophones that sound like you've just passed through an item box in Mario Kart or something. Though arguably the bigger attraction in this album beyond those would be the much longer tracks. For instance, the 19-minute In 256 Zeichen, low-hanging joke opportunity about my username on all other social media platforms aside. I will have to say, this cut did admittedly fall into the background for me a bit more often than I'd like and wasn't as big a favorite as I might have hoped. But it is still very nice, and provides a number of different evolutions as one would hope out of a track of that length. First sticking to some of the spaciest ambient synth passages the album has, transitioning into a new section building some rhythmic patterns over Hoshiko Yamane's violin performances, gradually fading into other parts that have brighter chord stabs, and finally ending in a good minute-long dramatic fade-out, which is neat. But that leaves the 14-minute closer and title track, which might be my actual favorite cut here. The level of propulsion that carries through the first major passages of the track, carrying over the first 9 minutes or so, might be the closest the album gets to matching the energy level and sense of drive present on Quantum Gate. But I think what really makes this track go the extra mile is right past that 9-minute mark, as Hoshiko Yamane's strings are reintroduced into the mix, and the track becomes much more emotionally hard-hitting. Hearing this track build up alongside the strings and slowly fade away at the very end, it kind of feels like we're, metaphorically watching Edgar's spirit blast off into the outer reaches of space as our final goodbye to him. Just reminds you of that one quote of his that all the articles initially announcing his passing back in 2015 had to mention. He has gone on record to say, "There is no death, just a change in our cosmic address." Not gonna lie, that definitely got to me. I might have teared up a bit there. I may not absolutely love this album as a whole. It is a definite step down production-wise from Quantum Gate back to their usual status quo. But I very much get the same feeling listening to it as I did when I heard Klaus Schulze's final record, Deus Arrakis, where the spacey vibes, mildly interesting textures, and deeper emotions are still able to carry across. And unlike that album, where Schulze probably did not plan it to be a send-off, this album is very much aware of the state the band is currently in and directly processing Edgar's loss, much more deliberately taking into account that looming specter of death and getting every track to evoke the feeling of Edgar's change in cosmic address quote. The band may still be touring at this point, and they can keep doing that, but I seriously hope that this really is the final studio album of new material released under the Tangerine Dream name. If Quantum Gate felt like Edgar's creative re-energizing cut off too soon by his passing, Raum feels like the rest of the band musically giving Edgar his last funeral rites and scattering his ashes across the galaxies, letting the gravity of the truth that he is no longer with us really sink in. And for all my poking fun at Edgar and slagging off on his commercially minded impulses throughout this video, for all the various game-changing classics and nostalgic favorites and baffling frustrations and tedious headaches that have been attached to the name Tangerine Dream, and the wildly inconsistent ups and downs that making this video and this whole series has taken me through, a send-off and tribute to him that specifically sounded like this, I think is just about the most fittingly poetic and profound way for the band he founded to go out on. And I think I can make peace with that. Raum can get a light 7.5 out of 10 from me. R.I.P. to Edgar Froese once again. And that is finally everything. I am so very tired. I'll probably throw together like a ranking video for the band's peak period albums to finish off the series soon, and then we can finally move on to other things. Thinking my next 2 discography reviews are going to be a heck of a lot shorter than this one has been, but yeah, that's it. That's Tangerine Dream odds and ends. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.